Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. Chapter 1. The Old World. It is difficult to realize that the earth on which Alexander the Great was born was the same in its main outlines as the earth on which we stand today, and at the same time to realize how very different from our present knowledge were men's ideas then of its area. Even modern writers picture Alexander as primitive in his notions, and it will be interesting to remember, when we find him anxious to press ever farther and farther east and south, that the philosophers of his time, especially his great teacher Aristotle, had just announced new arguments to prove that the earth was spherical in form. The old Homeric ideas that the earth was a flat disk, that the bronze firmament set with stars was upheld on great pillars by Atlas, and that the sun, as Herodotus imagined, could be blown out of its course by a strong wind, had passed away forever. Among the earliest peoples to travel about the sea were the Phoenicians, a Semitic race akin to the Jews, and the greatest trading and maritime race of antiquity. They ventured far in search of the rich merchandise which they brought back to their cities of Tyre and Sidon on the coast of Syria, to Carthage on the north coast of Africa, and to their other settlements at all quarters of the Mediterranean. They are believed to have learned the alphabet and other arts from their customers, the Egyptians, and to have been the teachers of the Greeks in these matters. The Phoenicians told nobody of the geographical knowledge which they acquired in their wanderings, as they were anxious to keep a trading monopoly. They rounded the coast of Spain by the Pillars of Hercules at a very early date, sailed through the Bay of Biscay, established trade with Britain, and perhaps even fetched amber from the shores of the Baltic. When the Greeks, however, first began to launch their merchantmen, the Phoenicians assured them that the Pillars of Hercules stood at the western end of the earth, and probably many of the legends which make early Greek geography so picturesque were invented by those wily adventurers in order to discourage the Greeks from following in their steps. Thus the Greeks of the early 5th century B.C. believed that the Arabian frankincense brought by the Phoenicians was guarded by dragons, and that screeching, winged animals sought to peck out the eyes of the Arabians who, clad in stout armor, gathered cassia by the shores of a remote lake. Cinnamon was supposed to be got by artful devices from the nests of birds on an unscalable precipice, and gold, the story ran, was stolen by the one-eyed Arimaspi from the Griffins. The Persians, who dazzled Greek eyes with their quantities of gold, told the Greeks that it was obtained by Indians at the peril of their lives. They were pursued, as they gathered the gold dust, by ants somewhat smaller than dogs, but bigger than foxes and swifter than any other animal on earth. Many of these legends had become discredited by Alexander's time, but it was owing to his travels that they passed forever out of the realm of geography into that of myth, as far as the ancients were concerned. The Greeks, unlike the Phoenicians, took a Platonic interest in geography, and before they had many facts to go upon, commenced to make maps of the world. More than that, they began to have ideas about the universe. Anaximander, who made the first map early in the 6th century B.C., declared his belief that the earth swung in the sky like the planets. He does not seem to have taught that it was spherical in shape, but later on in that century, Pythagoras made as great a stir as did Copernicus more than 2,000 years later, by declaring that the earth revolved round some great central fire in the heavens, and that it was itself a globe. These were only good guesses, and very few people could accept the curious, mystical reasons which Pythagoras gave for his opinions, but the philosophers of the 4th century approved of the theory of sphericity and found good reasons for it. Aristotle, who possessed one of the most scientific brains ever given to a mortal, said that the phenomena of gravitation would make the earth spherical, and pointed to the fact that the shadow cast by the earth on the moon in an eclipse was invariably circular in shape. Alexander, who had more than the normal Greek geographical curiosity, cannot have failed to know Aristotle's views. Before Alexander lived, the Greeks considered Delphi, where the shrine of Apollo stood, as the center of the earth's surface. Two eagles, the story ran, released by Zeus at the edges of the eastern and western oceans, had flown until they met at Delphi, where a stone, still in the museum there, was known as the navel of the earth. The Greeks originally divided the earth into the two continents of Asia, including Africa, the land of the sunrise, and Europe, the land of night. But by the 5th century B.C. they had come to recognize the third continent of Africa, which they named Libya. America and Australia were not to emerge until 2 millenniums had passed over. The Red Indians enjoyed their hunting grounds as yet undisturbed by any white man, and even the Phoenician traders had caught up no story of the Australian aborigines. In the three continents which composed the Old World, no one in Alexander's time had any idea of the vast expanse of Africa or of the southern extension of India. The existence of China was unsuspected, while the Pillars of Hercules remained the western boundary of the world at the conqueror's death. About a year after Alexander passed away, Pythias, a Greek, sailed between the Pillars and cruised along the coast of France to Britain. He was probably the first of his countrymen to venture so far. The Greek knowledge of Europe was almost confined to the small portion of it inhabited by themselves, that was, the most easternly of the three peninsulas of the Mediterranean, Greece, colonies on the shores of Thrace and the Hellespont, numerous cities planted on the heel and toe of Italy and in Sicily, and one or two colonies on the coasts of Gaul and Spain. Of inland Spain they knew nothing. At the time of Alexander's accession, the Greek cities of South Italy were engaged in a life-and-death struggle with Italian tribes, among whom the Romans were not yet predominant. If Alexander had lived longer, he might have further changed the course of the world's history by conquering Italy, but as it was, he never went near Italy, which is thus out of our story. His only connection with Rome was to prepare her path by his own work. North of the three peninsulas, little was known to anyone except perhaps the Phoenicians. In this district our own Germanic and Celtic ancestors were living, far away from the central stage of history. The Germanic peoples were settled on the northwest shores of the Baltic, and separated from Mediterranean civilization by widespread Celtic tribes. At the commencement of Alexander's reign, the Celtic people inhabited North Italy, Spain, France, Britain, and the Netherlands as far as the Weser, as far east as the lower Danube, and almost as far south at that point as the borders of Macedonia. These people, of huge stature and proverbial for their pride, were well known to the Greeks. In 390 B.C. they had made their famous sack of Rome, and after Alexander's death they nearly broke down the power of Macedonia. Alexander's relations with them only amounted to a military demonstration on his part, and their subjugation was reserved for the Romans. The continent of Africa recognized by the Greeks did not include Egypt, which they considered to be in Asia, as it was a member of the Persian Empire. Egypt was to be conquered by Alexander, and through his conquest, many events fateful for modern civilization were to happen. West of Egypt lay the important Greek colony of Cyrene, and farther west Carthage, the rival of the Greeks now, as she was to be in future times of the Romans. South of these states there were strange races called by the Africans, what they probably were, gorillas, and according to Greek tales, there were still wilder men and women with eyes in their shaggy breasts, and with dogs' heads or no heads at all. In the continent of Asia, all but a year of Alexander's reign was spent, and the scene of our story will lie there almost entirely. His invasion of the Persian Empire is a chapter in the old struggle between West and East, commenced when the Greek Agamemnon besieged Troy and continued when the Persian monarchs, Darius and Xerxes invaded Greece in the days of Marathon and Salamis. 2 centuries before Alexander's birth, Persia had risen to be the chief power in the Old World, and its sovereign assumed the title of King of Kings, or Lord of the 4 quarters of the earth. Today we should call this ruler over many peoples an emperor, but emperor was one of the words invented by the Romans, and not used in the present sense before the establishment of the Roman Empire. In modern histories, therefore, these ancient rulers of the Persian Empire are often styled for convenience the Great King. Before turning our attention to Macedonia and Alexander, we will now look briefly at the history of the formation of the Persian Empire and its connection with Greece before the rise of Macedonia. 3 great empires had risen and passed in Western Asia before the birth of Alexander, those of the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Medes. Assyria, with its capital at Nineveh, in ruins in Alexander's time, and Babylonia, with its capital Babylon, still one of the finest cities in the world, formed the district of Mesopotamia, between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. Its civilization was perhaps as old as that of Egypt, and far older than that of Greece. The Medes established their supremacy over this district in the 7th century BC, and came into bitter conflict with the Greeks of Asia Minor and the Aegean Islands, but it was reserved for the Persians, the successors of the Medes, to attack Greece proper. Before, however, the Persians could expand westward into Greek lands, they had to overrun the strong state of Lydia, concerning which such charming stories have been handed down to us by the Greeks. Beside their western colonies, the Greeks had planted cities on the coast of Asia Minor before the memory of man. 3 successive strips of coast, Aeolus, Ionia, and Doris, going from north to south, represented the Aeolian, Ionian, and Dorian tribes of Greece. Adjoining, there stretched from north to south the non-Greek districts of Phrygia, Mysia, Lydia, Caria, and Lycia. The Lydians extended their supremacy over Greek cities westward and northward, and over Assyrian provinces eastward, until at last their boundary was established at the river Halys, which runs northward into the Black Sea. At their capital, Sardis, the great road from Mesopotamia terminated. For a long time Lydia formed a barrier between the restless Medes and Greece, but in the middle of the 6th century its power was destroyed by the Persian Cyrus, who rebelled against Media and established a Medo-Persian empire. His subjects were largely Medes, and generally called Medes by the Greeks. The last Lydian king was Croesus, whose wealth, famed then, has now become proverbial. Croesus sought in vain to oppose the westward advance of Cyrus, and was at last, in 546 BC, driven into his capital, which was besieged and taken by the Persian conqueror. After the subjugation of Lydia, the Persians occupied the Greek coast towns and the Greek islands off the coast of Asia Minor. Mighty Babylon fell in 538 BC. Ancient Egypt became a Persian satrapy in 525 BC, and the Perso-Median Empire extended from the Nile to Afghanistan. Darius I, a ruler only to be compared with Alexander, divided his vast dominions into provinces, satrapies, and established the capital at Susa, about 150 miles from the Persian Gulf. The royal road from Sardis, the head of the new Persian satrapy of Lydia and Ionia, were extended to Susa. It was 1,500 miles long and made swift communication possible between west and east. Along the line of this road, the first postal service was established. Men and horses were kept in readiness at stations of a day's journey from each other, and the rider from the first station delivered his letter to a rider at the second, who rode off to the third, and so on along the whole route. Nothing mortal, the Greeks said, traveled so fast as these Persian messengers, who were hindered neither by snow, rain, heat, nor the darkness of night. Naturally, inns grew up at the stations, and other travelers, besides postmen and adventurous merchants, began to pass about from country to country. Darius crossed into Europe in about 512 B.C., subdued Thrace, and, like Alexander after him, made a military demonstration across the Danube. The next step was to conquer Greece, for the Greeks were encouraging their kinsmen in Asia Minor to revolt against Persia. A rising in Ionia took place in 499, and Athens aided in burning Sardis. For the first time the great king heard of the existence of the Athenians, and it is said he bade the attendant say to him thrice daily when his dinner was spread, "Master, remember the Athenians," for he meant to punish them heavily when he should have time. The Ionian rebellion practically came to an end in 494, when Miletus submitted. Its male inhabitants were put to the sword, while the women and children were sent as slaves to Susa. Nothing remained but to punish Eretria and Athens for aiding the rebels, and Darius, declaring himself overlord of Greece, sent to her chief cities to demand earth and water. Footnote: the Asiatic symbols of submission. End footnote. As a sign of subjection. At Sparta his envoys were thrown into a well. At Athens they were hurled into the pit of punishment, wherein iron hooks tore the bodies of falling malefactors. And in 490 B.C., therefore, the Persians sailed for Greece, bringing with them the tyrant Hippias, whom the Athenians had expelled from their city. Burning Eretria, they landed their large army on the plains of Marathon, where, by the lowest estimate, 6,400 Medes fell, while the Athenians lost only 192 men. This defeat probably seemed of little consequence to the Persians, but it was of the greatest consequence in Greek history. It really only showed that the Greek soldier well led was more than a match for a number of Asiatic badly led. But it gave the Greeks a confidence which made them irresistible against the Persians. Darius died in 485, and was followed on the throne by Syria, under whom the greater invasion of Greece took place. Unlike Darius, Syria determined to come over in person, and it was not until 480 that his enormous force was ready. In the summer of 481 he left Susa and came up to Lydia, staying with Theseus, the richest man in the world after himself. Before crossing the Hellespont in 480 he took up his position on a white marble throne on a hill near Abydos to review his countless troops on the shore below, draining rivers dry in its course. Footnote: modern estimates of the numbers which might be led so far spoil this old story. End footnote. The army marched over Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly to the pass of Thermopylae, where Leonidas and his 300 Spartan soldiers made their immortal resistance. From Thermopylae the Persians advanced south and burned Athens, deserted by its citizens, but the Athenians defeated the Persians in the great naval battle in the Bay of Salamis, 480 B.C., and Syrius fled away to secure his bridge over the Hellespont. He left his general, Mardonius, to winter in Thessaly, but in the spring of 479 Mardonius was defeated by the United Greek States at the decisive battle of Plataea. The olive tree of Athenia sprung up afresh on the Acropolis at Athens. A new and finer array of temples soon took the place of those burned down, and over all Greece there dawned, as a result of the Persian wars, a more splendid day. The story of Greece until the Macedonian conquest was that of numerous city-states entirely independent of each other. A few of the largest cities had subjugated some of their neighbors, but this subjugation was fiercely resented, and the subject city was always ready to throw off the yoke, while the attempts of one or two leading states to establish small empires roused a clamor of indignation. We know today that the nation was bound to supersede the city-state, and we wish that the Greeks could have united in a voluntary federation, and so avoided the fate of passing under the yoke of an inferior civilization. But we see that there were the greatest difficulties in the path of such a movement. In this mountainous country, nature kept the different towns apart. Each was a separate family, and nothing would induce them to enter into a common life under one national roof. When joint action became necessary, as in the Persian Wars, national leaders like Athens and Sparta emerged, but whenever one state won any superiority over the other, it always abused its power. Athens and Sparta were yokefellows in the leadership of Hellas during the Persian Wars, Sparta being regarded as the military head of Greece, while Athens was its intellectual chief. Whether the ancient Spartans were a merely martial race remains the same problem to history as it was to their contemporaries. Their sternly trained youths were models of masculine beauty, and though they seldom spoke, they sometimes came out, Plato tells us, with pithy sayings which made other people feel childish. But whether they were the deepest of philosophers or the simplest of fighting peoples, their wisdom was of no benefit to the other Greeks or to the afterworld. They kept it so jealously to themselves that most people are uncharitable enough to think its existence in Athenian fiction. It was difficult enough for a stranger to find entry into Sparta at any time, and they carefully expelled strangers from their gates, so the Athenians said, before holding any intellectual assemblies. The Athenians, fortunately for the afterworld, loved to communicate their ideas. After the Second Persian War, Athens became the first state in Greece, and so remained until the close of the 5th century B.C. The Parthenon, still lovely though spoiled by time, Turk, friend and foe, rose on the Acropolis. Aeschylus had fought at Marathon, and soon afterwards the young Sophocles commenced to produce his tragedies. Euripides, born on the day of Salamis, lived to see the decline of his great city. Driven into exile by unworthy attacks, he came north to the court of Macedonia, and there died. Peculiarly associated with Macedonia, lines from Euripides spring to the lips of Alexander and from his companions at the great moments of their lives, and in estimating Alexander's attitude toward the religion of his age, it is well to remember that he must have been plentifully nourished on a poet who was a notorious heretic. In Macedonia, Euripides wrote his Bacchae, which, according to an ingenious modern explanation of its meaning, was the boldest Euripidean attack on the Olympic deities. The most remarkable personality of 5th century Athens was one who left no written word behind him, but on the contrary informed all and sundry that he knew nothing. To him, nevertheless, far more justly than to Aristotle, might be given the title of master of those that know. This was Socrates, the teacher, although he disclaimed such a title, of this great generation. Through his chief companion, Plato, the wisdom of Socrates was handed down to Aristotle, Plato's cleverest pupil, and as tutor of Alexander, an important character in our history. For a few years of his boyhood, Alexander was in direct contact with the best thought of the world. Socrates, too, saw the beginning of the decline of his city, and the day of its humiliation, and the Athenian people stained its annals by forcing him to drink the cup of hemlock in 399, on the threefold charge of not worshipping the city gods, of introducing new gods, a most ignorant accusation, and of corrupting the youth of the city. Whenever in after years men have described the ideal city-state destroyed by Macedonia, they may have been forced to make a more or less feeble apology for the murder of Socrates by the city government. The invasions by Persia had roused for the first time a national feeling in Greece, and Athens was able to form a federation which contained the germs of a nation. In the end, however, her yoke was found unbearable by her allies, and when they were able to do so, they immediately threw it off. This federation was a union of states, mostly Ionian, formed in 478 B.C., with its headquarters at Delos, the sacred island where the twins Apollo and Artemis were born. Athens undertook to be treasurer, Very soon the Delian League became the Athenian Empire, and the allies tributary vassals. It had been formed in the deepest national enthusiasm for the defense of Greece against Persia and the liberation of Asia Minor, and the voluntary activity of Athens had created a real loyalty toward that public-spirited state in all Ionian communities. Her statesman, Pericles, could truly say in his famous speech, "Athens is the school of Hellas, and we have compelled every land and every sea to open a path for our valor, and have everywhere planted eternal memorials of our friendship and of our enmity." Now the splendid tyrant city, on the magnificent buildings of which there was suspiciously much money to spare, excited the jealousy and anger of her allies, who could with difficulty pay the tribute, and Sparta, quite put into the shade by Athens, was still more wroth. In 431 B.C., therefore, the fatal Peloponnesian War broke out, and by its close in 404 B.C., Athens had been stripped of her empire, and Sparta was more important than ever in Greece. Worse than this, national feeling had been injured by Athens' failure. The Greek states would rather now give earth and water to the great king than acquiesce in the rule of one of their own number. Moreover, the Athenian example had roused an imperial hunger. It was considered wicked to subjugate another Greek state, and yet each had seen the advantage of doing so. From her league there had rolled into Athens a great current of trade, and her rivals had begun to meditate on how to obtain wealth by the same means. In 404 B.C., the long walls of Athens, built during this century from the city to the sea, were pulled down to the sound of flutes amid the wild rejoicing of her enemies, and for a short time a Spartan garrison occupied the Athenian Acropolis. But Athens revived in the most marvelous fashion, and was able to re-enter the lists in the 4th century B.C. The 4th century was occupied until the Macedonian conquest by the struggles of the various states for supremacy. Sparta, convalescent Athens, Thebes, and a Thessalian tyrant took it in turns to sway Greece, and the fall of each of them was brought about by a famous battle. Sparta was preeminent from 404 to 371. It was not content to be figurehead as in old days, but proved a greater tyrant to her allies and subjects than Athens had ever been. She had obtained the aid of Persia in reducing Athens, and allowed the Persians to take back the Greek cities of Asia Minor as a reward, but now began to pose as the national champion against Persia. Her warlike king, Agesilaus, formed plans like those afterward carried out by Alexander the Great. He invaded Asia Minor and won several victories over the Persians, but the Spartan fleet was defeated, and Persia, alienated from Sparta, assisted Athens in her wonderful recovery, helping her to rebuild her long walls and refortify her port. At the earliest possible moment, Athens eagerly discarded the Persian alliance, but by the peace of Antalcidas, 387 B.C., the Greeks were forced to abandon their kinsmen in Asia Minor to the tender mercies of Persia. Scarcely 100 years had gone by since Marathon, and yet there was little feeling against this westward return of Persia. Far less outcry was made than when Greek cities were forced to accept the overlordship of the Greek sovereigns of Macedonia. Sparta fell in 371 B.C., when her tyrannous attack on Thebes was defeated at Leuctra. Her place was taken by Thebes, an old-fashioned country town whose provincial citizens, proverbially stupid, were little expected to make any noise in the world, although Thebes in old times had furnished not only heroes, but gods to Greece. The commander of the Thebans at Leuctra was the great general Epaminondas, who had evolved a new method of fighting. Like the Spartan hoplites, his soldiers carried pikes, but instead of using shallow lines of regular depth, Epaminondas formed at one part a wedge of men standing so close together that their shoulders touched, and their pikes projected past the men in front of them. This phalanx or column charged against the Spartans, who were drawn up in the usual columns, widespread and of little depth, and broke through their lines by sheer impact. The Spartans were at once thrown into disorder. The rest of the Theban columns joined in, and a scene of carnage followed. Philip and Alexander of Macedon afterward made use of this new wedge in their battles. Not only at Leuctra did the Thebans perform the unheard-of action of defeating a Spartan army fighting under its king, but they proceeded to invade the Peloponnesus and harried the lands of Sparta up to the precincts of the city itself. It was in 367 B.C. that Thebes, Athens, and other Greek states appealed to the great king to settle their disputes. Theban supremacy was bitterly contested, but remained a fact until the death of Epaminondas, who was slain while winning a great victory at Mantinea in 362 B.C. Thebes' power fell with her hero, but neither Athens nor Sparta was to profit by it. For long, Greece refused to recognize the fact, but the Macedonian conquest had already begun. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. Philip II of Macedonia. Macedonia, over which Turk, Greek, Bulgarian, and Servian have quarreled so bitterly today, became for the first time a united monarchy under Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great. It lay north of Thessaly, from which it was divided by the lofty Cimbunian range of hills, snow-capped Olympus, the home of the Greek gods, towering over its southern border. On the west, the mountains of Scardas and Pindus separated from Illyria and all communication with the Adriatic, except for the narrow valley of Ehudicus and a few mountain passes. In the east, the boundary between Macedonia and Thrace was, until Philip's reign, the river Axius, the Vardar, which flowed southeast to the Gulf of Therme. Round this gulf stretched the fertile province of Emathia, the nucleus of the Macedonian sovereignty. Among its hills stood the oldest capital, Aigai, and lower down, in a dreary position over the marshes, the new capital, Pella, where today scarcely a stone remains of the city from which Alexander the Great set forth to conquer the world. Alexander's successor, Cassander, removed the capital to the coast, and at Therme sprang up the new town of Thessalonica, now the dirty and picturesque Babel of Salonika, of the utmost importance as a railway terminus. Eastward lay the three-pronged peninsula of Chalcidice, for which Philip fought so bitterly with Athens, and farther east, Greek colonies were scattered along the coast as far as and beyond Byzantium, destined in Christian times under the name of Constantinople to become the capital of a new Greek empire, and afterward the headquarters of the Turk. The Greeks of Alexander's day were as anxious to prove that Macedonia was not a Greek country as the Greeks of today are anxious to prove that it is a Greek country. The truth seems to have been that in these northern mountains a conquering Greek stock had united with the native Illyrians and Thracians. The Macedonians spoke a Greek dialect and retained Greek traits, but cut off as they were from communication with their southern kinsfolk, they had come to seem a barbarous people to the cultured Greeks of the south. These latter, however, seldom questioned that the Macedonian kings were of Greek descent, and a legend existed that Perdiccas, a scion of the royal house of Argos, itself descended from Heracles, had fled with his brethren into northern Greece, and after living for long as a cowherd, had gradually conquered all Macedonia. The first historical king of Macedonia is Amnitas, c. 540 through 498 B.C., who was compelled to submit to Darius the Great. His son, Alexander I, 498 through 454 B.C., extended his domains, but was forced, though extremely unwilling, to aid Chares as his vassal in his invasion of Greece. His right to take part in the Olympic Games was called in question, but the Greek descent of his line was recognized, and he strove and obtained the garland. His son, Perdiccas II, 448 through 413 BC, aided in the destruction of the Athenian Empire. His successor, Archelaus, raised himself to the throne by many crimes, but he was an able ruler and the patron of Greek art and a friend of Euripides. He came down from Aegae to Pella and established a brilliant court there. Thus the flame of civilization was kindled in this land of the wild beast and the huntsmen and warring highland tribes. The names of the successors of Archelaus are as much a matter of dispute as the amount of truth in the lurid stories handed down of the crimes they committed. But Macedonia was comparatively tranquil at the accession of Alexander II in 370 BC. He was called in by the Thessalian cities in 369 BC to aid them against the tyrant of Thrace, and proved difficult to get rid of when he had performed his task, but was subdued by the Thebans. He was murdered by the Macedonian Ptolemy, who became regent for the heir, Perdiccas III, and made a treaty with Thebes in 367 BC, sending Philip, younger brother of Perdiccas, to Thebes as a hostage. There Philip remained, learning all he could in that great school for soldiers until 364 BC, when he returned to Macedonia. On the death of Perdiccas in 359 BC, he became guardian of his brother's son and heir, Amyntas, but soon, at the request of the nobles, assumed the kingship as Philip II. At the time when his brother Perdiccas fell, fighting against the hill tribes, Philip II was 24 years of age. His part in the world hitherto had been chiefly that of observer, and we may guess of roisterer, but he at once displayed the very highest practical ability, and brought an iron will to the carrying out of schemes as vast as those of his greater son. Philip loved more to make merry than Alexander ever did, but Demosthenes, no friend of his, was right when he told the pleasure-loving Athenians the secret of his success. Philip, he said, for the sake of empire and absolute power, had his eye knocked out, his collarbone broken, his hand and his leg maimed, and was ready to resign any part of his body that fortune chose to take from him, provided that with what remained he might live in honor and glory. He was more cynical than Alexander, or at least more outspoken about it, for he was accustomed to say that he could take any fortress into which an ass laden with gold could climb, and he did more by diplomacy of this and other sorts than by war. This portrait, drawn of him by an historian of a few centuries later, is not an unfair one. His chief wealth was his army. He was more skilled in obtaining riches than in keeping them. So, though certainly engaged in rapine, he was ever poor. He was equally mild and faithless. To him, no way of conquering was base. He was both persuasive and deceptive in speech, and would promise more than he would stand by, a master of both wisdom and fooling. He cherished friendships according to their profitableness, not as a matter of honor. He would constantly pretend liking for an enemy, and simulate vexation against those dear to him. It was his practice to stir up discord among allies, and to try to keep in favor with both parties. Add to these traits a distinguished eloquence, pith, and experience as a speaker, with neither ease lacking to ornament, nor ornament to invention. This well-qualified prince now came to the head of affairs in Macedonia, and at once, as if by magic, the pretenders to the throne disappeared, and the hill tribes were broken, the troublesome Paeonian and Illyrian vassals of Macedonia being quelled at last with great slaughter by the man who had learned how to fight from Epaminondas. Philip, however, modified the idea which he had learned from Epaminondas. Both he and Alexander were accustomed to concentrate their strength at one point of the line in the Theban fashion, in order to throw the enemy's ranks into confusion. But they did this with a wedge of cavalry, not of infantry, and with their archers and slingers. The Macedonia phalanx of infantry became dreaded chiefly from the use which its leaders taught it to make of pikes considerably longer than those of the Greeks. Epaminondas had introduced the long pike, but Philip and Alexander used still longer ones. The ordinary Spartan pike was 12 feet in length. The Macedonian Sarissa was 14 or 16 feet in length in Alexander's time, and seems afterward to have been increased to the absurd extent of 24 feet. This appears to have been the military hierarchy as Philip left it. All Macedonians were the king's companions, the cavalry being simply known as companions, hetori; the infantry their inferiors in social rank as the foot commanders, peseteri; a picked force in both forming the agema of each. The most famous infantry corps was that of the guards, hypaspiste, about 3,000 in number, and including the infantry agema. They were afterward known as the Silver Shields, agaraspates, won fame under Philip and Alexander, and after the latter's death came to a tragic end through their betrayal of their general for a reward. Among other special institutions was that of the somatophylakes, 7 persons of great honor appointed to guard the king's person, evidently as a reward for some great deed. While boys of the chief families of Macedonia were brought up in the court in time of peace, and followed the king to war in the capacity of pages, Philip introduced the first standing professional army, for the Greek and Persian arrays were either citizen or mercenary levies. The citizens could not be kept together for long, and the mercenaries could not always be trusted, but now a national army was in readiness for use at any time that the king wished for it, winter or summer, and in Macedonia it was an army devoted to its king as the tribe is to the chieftain. Philip therefore created the Macedonian army, which was to be his son's instrument in conquering the world. He consolidated the various Macedonian tribes into one nation, and he made that nation a wealthy one by obtaining control of the gold mines of Mount Pangaius. Commanding these mines stood Amphipolis, near the mouth of the Strymon, the Struma, on its eastern frontier, and Philip outwitted the Athenians and obtained possession of Amphipolis in 357 B.C. He definitely abandoned Aigai and its traditions. The sovereign of Macedonia was to be no more the chieftain of a semi-savage people, but the autocrat of a cultured and powerful Greek realm. Philip's mother only learnt to read in her old age, but Pella might have claimed to be the Athens of the north when Alexander the Great saw the light there in 356, probably in the month of October. At this time Greece, still blind to coming events, invited Philip, as they had grown used to inviting the great king, to interfere in one of their quarrels. Twice he attacked Phocis, against which a sacred war had been declared, and although he was compelled to withdraw on each occasion, he managed to make himself overlord of Thessaly on his way through, thus adding the fine Thessalian cavalry to the Macedonian army. Then he continued to annex Greek cities on the coast adjoining Macedonia, build a fleet, and at last became a serious menace to Athenian trade. The first person to take the alarm was the Athenian orator Demosthenes, who, by his ardent philippics, commenced to create a panic in the city. Many people nowadays think that Demosthenes showed lack of political vision, and blame him for throwing obstacles in the path of the force which was at work striving to create a united Greek people. To others he will always remain the last defender of his country's liberties and a prophet who preached military and naval defense, but was unheeded until it was too late. To all he stands for a panic monger whose predictions came to pass. Again and again he sought to unite southern Greece against Philip, and at last he inspired the resistance, which collapsed in 338 B.C. at Chaeronea, fatal to liberty, as Milton sang. Meanwhile Philip was permitted to come south, pass through Thermopylae, and in a third attack on Phocis, destroy the Phocian cities, even Athens lifting no finger to stop him, despite Demosthenes' outcry. Phocis had possessed the presidency of the Amphictyonic League, and this position of high honor Philip received from the servile electors, the name of Phocis being struck off the list altogether. After Demosthenes' second Philippic in 344 B.C., Persia was less hated in Athens than was Macedonia. Philip took little notice. In 342, 341, he made Thrace a Macedonian province, and he might have conquered the Chersonese but for Athens. Then, after a successful attack on the barbarians at the mouth of the Danube, he turned south for his last and fateful journey into Greece. This time it was to aid in a sacred war against Amphissa. He was allowed by the anti-Macedonian party to pass Thermopylae, but at Charoneia, 338 B.C., Thebans and Athenians and the citizens of many a lesser state, including the dispossessed Phocians, stood drawn up in battle array to resist the farther passage of the Macedonian. A bitter struggle took place, and Philip, it is said, would have been slain but for the aid of Alexander, who, now a boy of 18, commanded the cavalry and made the decisive attack on the Greek allies. All fled except the sacred band of Thebes, who fought on until they fell, like Leonidas and his Spartans in the days of old, and so gave to Charoneia a glory something like that of Thermopylae. Athens became a member of the Macedonian Empire without a further effort, and Philip marched south into the Peloponnesus to try to obtain Sparta's submission. Entirely without a national spirit, Sparta had taken little part in the protection of Greece, but she refused to submit to the invader, and Philip, after devastating her territories, retired, probably grudging the time required for the reduction of this city which was now of so little importance in the world. He then held a congress of Greek states at the Isthmus of Corinth, 337 B.C., and was elected commander-in-chief for a great expedition against Persia. This appointment was the formal acknowledgment of Macedonia's supremacy. There is nothing to show what was the magnitude of Philip's designs against Persia, and owing to the fact that the Athenians and Spartans of Philip's time took no interest in foreign affairs, we are entirely ignorant as to what may have been the nature of the Persian peril at this point, or if it was some commercial advantage which the maker of Macedonia proposed to obtain for his country from his projected invasion. Certain it is that he shares whatever blame there may be for this deed with Alexander, for he sent out his chief general, Parmenio, in 336 B.C., to occupy the other side of the Hellespont and prepare for the passage of his army. In this year, however, an end was put to this active existence by the hand of an assassin. The assassin had a deep enough grievance of his own, but it was known that he was stirred up by Olympias, the mother of Alexander, for a reason of which we shall hear later, and some people thought that Alexander, utterly estranged from his father, had a hand in the business. Olympias was a character as much out of the ordinary as Philip himself. From Philip, Alexander got his extraordinarily wide political grasp, his restless energy, and his indomitable will. His debt to his mother is less certain. She was of the royal family of Epirus, and claimed descent from Achilles, as Philip did from Heracles. She, like Philip, was characterized by marvelous energy, and she was passionate, revengeful, and mystical, qualities which peer out as rare visitants in Alexander. The chief fact known about her is her following of the new religion which had penetrated into Greece from Thrace during the last few centuries. By the close of the 5th century, the belief of cultured Greeks in the old gods of Olympus had waned. Even a conservative marked the old idea of Charon ready with his ferry boat to take souls across to Hades. There had sprung up, on the ruins of the old faiths, two new forms of religion. The philosopher of the stage, Euripides, who exercised the strongest influence on religion from his own time until the Christian era, revived the Greek idea, found in Homer, that human passions are due to possession by the gods, so that Ares, Aphrodite, Dionysus, and Demeter, for example, could enter into a man for their own purposes, perhaps punishment for neglecting their altars, and sway him as they list, to virtue or crime. Thus we find Alexander, before the battle of Issus, sacrificing to the god Fear, and he always thought that he slew Clytus at a drunken feast because Dionysus was angry with him for destroying Thebes, the home of the god's mother, Semele. Above and beyond these deities, however, the Greeks believed that there were powers which punished wrongdoers. The cry of the injured person was in itself a curse, and for the righteous man, as Euripides sang, far away, hidden from the eyes of day, watchers are there in the skies that can see man's life and prize deeds well done by things of clay. The height of the normal faith of Greek and Asiatic in the 4th century B.C., as with the Mohammedan and Japanese of today, was to bow cheerfully to the will of destiny. Orphism, however, had given to those emotionally inclined a more inspiring faith, and Olympius was among its adherents. It was a worship of Dionysus and Orpheus, with mysterious ceremonies kept so closely secret that, although the initiated were very numerous, little is known of their tenets now. There is no sign that Alexander was influenced by Orphism, which was indeed largely a religion of the common people. Philip was tired both of the eccentricities of Olympias and her temper, and took a young wife, Cleopatra, thereby incurring the wrath of both mother and son. Alexander went to his father's wedding feast in no very good mood, and we hear of the first of those fits of passion which were to come on him in after years in the East. When the wine had been circulating freely for some time, the uncle of Cleopatra began to indulge in remarks insulting to Olympias and to Alexander, and speedily received Alexander's drinking cup full in the face. Philip leaped to his feet and drew his sword, ready in his drunken frenzy to slay his son, but slipped and fell, whereupon Alexander stood taunting him. "Look," he cried to the courtiers, "the man who is getting ready to cross over into Asia can't even step from one couch to another." The prince then took his mother to her kinsfolk in Epirus and himself retired into Illyria. The affair was patched up for appearance's sake, but there remained a bitterness between father and son which nothing could remove, and probably neither Olympias nor Alexander ever forgave the slur put on both of them. There is a pleasanter side to Alexander's relationship with his father, and we shall consider it in the next chapter, but a friendship which seems to have been deep, at least on Philip's side, had unfortunately been broken before the latter's death. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Alexander as Prince. Alexander III, the Great, was, as we have seen, born at Pella in the autumn of 356 B.C., while Philip was busy outwitting the Athenians in Chalcidice and annexing its towns. He had just taken Potidæa when 3 pieces of good news were brought to him. One was the victory of his chariot in the races at Olympia. The second was a great slaughter of the Illyrians by a Macedonian army, and the third was the birth of his son and heir, Alexander. The chief omen which marked the night of the boy's birth was the burning down of the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Some courtier of Alexandria afterwards said that Artemis was so occupied on that night with what was going on in Macedonia that she forgot her own affairs, but the people of Asia read a deeper significance into the event. A story was invented that a madman had destroyed the splendid building, and when asked his reason, replied, "Only to make my memory immortal by a great crime." And the soothsayers, they said, had prophesied that somewhere in the world at that hour a man had been born who should utterly destroy Asia for a similar reason. Alexander was not a madman, but he was certainly born to inflict a great deal of evil upon Asia, and so this tale is of interest. His childhood, as well as his manhood, was dominated by the dream of conquering the Persian Empire. Many are the stories, some no doubt true, many of them legends, told us of Alexander's youth, and it is curious that although he was Olympia's only child, we should have no single anecdote of mother and son in these early years. His foster mother, a noble Macedonian woman named Hellenice or Lanice, daughter of Dropidas, held the first place in his infancy, and probably continued to do so. Her brother Clytus was afterward one of his chief generals. When a Greek boy was about 6 years of age, his school life began, and Alexander's education seemed to have followed the regular course. He had for governor his mother's kinsman, Leonidas, and for inferior instructor and attendant, pedagogue as the Greeks called it, the Archarnanian Lysimachus, while another, Archinanian, Philip, had charge of his health and afterwards accompanied him to Asia as his physician. Anaximenes, then or later, taught him rhetoric. Leonidas, perhaps instructed by the prince's father, gave the boy a Spartan's training, searching his chest to see that no unnecessary luxury had been put into them, and severely repressing extravagance. Once he stopped the child as he was throwing handfuls of incense on the fire at a sacrifice, and told him, "Thus you may sacrifice when you have conquered the regions where frankincense grows." Alexander had evidently been chattering about his future great deeds, and was annoyed at his master's lack of confidence in him. Some years later, when his dreams had come true, he sent many £100 worth of perfumes from Asia to Leonidas, with the injunction, "Be less stingy in sacrificing to the gods, for, as you see in my case, they repay generously gifts cheerfully made." Alexander was taught, like Frederick the Great, to sleep little. Like a young Spartan, he scorned the adornment of his body, caring for nothing but its hardihood and suppleness, and eternally exercising it. His one coquetry was his armor. From the remark of Leonidas about the incense, we know that his earliest days were filled with ambitious dreams of a well-defined nature. One day, after marvelous wars and journeys, he would become lord of Asia, and he grew increasingly uneasy at the extent of his father's conquest, and could hardly contain his rage when the Asiatic scheme came to be mooted. That was not to come for a few years, but meanwhile he informed his companions, Ptolemy, Nearchus, Phrygius, Lysimachus, and Harpalus, that his father would leave nothing great for them to do when they were grown up. And when the court was rejoicing over some new victory of King Philip's, Alexander would sit by in moody silence. When he was 7 years old, they say, he carefully questioned some Persian satraps who had come to the court at Pella, how many days' journey it was from Macedonia to the Persian capital, what sort of king Artaxerxes was, and what sort of an army he had. He would seldom engage in useless amusements or youthful competitions, and when it was suggested that he ran swiftly enough to win a prize in the Greek games, he said, "I would compete if I could have kings for my antagonists." At the age of 13, Philip seems to have considered that Alexander's was too high and fine a spirit to remain under the control of pedagogues any longer, and needed the most skilful management if his character was not to be spoiled. It was now time for Aristotle of Stagira, son of a court physician of Macedonia, to be called in. At Alexander's birth, Philip, it is said, wrote straightway to Aristotle, "I announce to you the birth of my son. I do not so much thank the gods that he is born, but because his birth happened in your time, by whom he may be trained and taught. Nor, I hope, will he be unworthy of either of us, nor unequal to the control of my kingdom. For I would rather be childless than be the unhappy father of a child who should bring dishonor to his race." Thus, in 343 B.C., Aristotle, not yet as famous as he was to become, was invited to try his hand at forming a model ruler, as Plato and Sicily had had the opportunity of forming a model state. From his own point of view, Aristotle was to fail as utterly as Plato. Philip might well feel secure now that he had obtained a tutor like Aristotle for his son. The philosopher was a gracious, graceful personality, a courtier and the son of a courtier, able to teach Alexander the ways of men as well as the contents of books. In all branches of human learning, the saying is still, "Go back to Aristotle," and Alexander is said to have testified that from his father Philip he had received life, but from Aristotle the knowledge of how to live well. Philip gave them a schoolhouse at pleasant Maesa, where Aristotle's stone seats and shady walks were shown for long. Aristotle may have given Alexander his copy of Homer. He is said to have corrected the manuscript, and in the 3 or 4 years which he spent on the education of Alexander and his friends, he must have thrown new light on the whole of literature, politics, and religion. He probably remained enthroned in his pupil's imagination as an authority on literature and religion, but Alexander never paid any attention to his political ideas. Aristotle had no political adaptability. He had been brought up in a Greek city-state, and the Greek city-state remained for him the one perfect form of government. He believed that it should be so small that one man could address all the citizens, and they might all be well known to one another. There is much to be said for the small state in the interests of ideal government, but there are possibilities of justice and virtue under other forms of rule, and to these possibilities Aristotle was blind. He does not even consider the empire in his politics. The Persian realm, which lay like a waxing moon round Greece, was to him merely a congregation of slaves under a slave-driver. He believed that Asiatics were by nature slaves, and he advised Alexander, in a treatise on monarchy, to treat them as such. But on this point at least the pupil was a greater statesman than the master, and when he became king of Asia, Alexander put Greek and Asiatic on a footing of absolute equality. How he came to it we do not know. Perhaps it was from his father, but Alexander, alone in his age, conceived the great doctrine of the brotherhood of man. It is not to be conceived that Aristotle was ignorant of the notion, for he must have turned every human institution about in every light. But like Plato, he deeply disapproved of it, both theoretically and because in 5th century Athens, cosmopolitanism had meant deterioration. Foreign merchants had handed and departed in streams at Piraeus, and the adaptable citizens had speedily taken to imitating their ways, with the result that the moral foundations of the state had been threatened, for already in that early age, men adopting new manners and customs began to question the existence of a universal right and wrong. So deeply did Plato feel the danger from this, that he would not have had a city built on the coast for fear of the visits of foreigners. To him and to Aristotle, the inland valley of the Eurotas, where Sparta reigned, was the ideal situation for a virtuous state. Alexander in Asia was in a false position from Aristotle's point of view, and he could give him no reasonable advice. We can imagine him discovering with horror that this boy, whose opinions were one day to be of such importance, had ideas of politics into which his own beloved city-state entered not at all. And it is strange to picture his position in the Macedonian court when it was humming with the excitement of Philip's Asiatic plans. Aristotle's political ideas do not seem to have influenced Alexander in the slightest, and in revenge in after years, when Alexander was conquering the world and Aristotle at Athens was continuing his politics, the latter persisted in omitting the empire, as if too big a monstrosity to notice, from his considerations of forms of government. It is strange, again, that Aristotle took no notice in his scientific writings of the new fauna discovered in Alexander's journeys, and in fact there seems to have been a complete breach between the philosopher and his pupil. When Alexander set out for Asia, however, they were still on good terms. The young king is said to have invited his master to accompany him, to have given him vast sums for his scientific pursuits, and furnished him with 1,000 naturalists to carry out the details of his investigations. Aristotle's treatise on monarchy was addressed to Alexander, and his work concerning colonies was written as advice to him. On the whole, however, the man to whom the world traces back most of its intellectual notions, and the man who altered the whole course of Western history, brought into the closest contact in an important relation, had remarkably little influence on each other's lives. That Alexander had great knowledge of geography, engineering, and science generally appears in his life, but he was clearly enough not an all-around genius. Montaigne said that it was possible to conceive of Socrates in the place of Alexander, but not of Alexander in the place of Socrates. Most people would find it hard to imagine either of these things. There is an amusing story of Alexander writing from Asia to chide Aristotle for publishing books on esoteric philosophy. "You have not done well," ran the letter, "for wherein will your pupils be above others, if those things which you have secretly taught us be made common to all? I assure you I would rather excel others in learning than in dominion." Aristotle may well have thought that Alexander's actions belied his words, but he did not say so. Instead, he returned a polite and soothing missive, saying that these books were published and yet not published, for as Socrates had taught the world, no man can learn anything which he did not know already. Alexander perhaps meant what he said about preferring letters to warfare, and had realized early that his life was not his own. In stormy times, he to whom the book is dear may bear the sword, but not the crown, and when Alexander lived, the national existence of Macedonia, and the expansion which was vital to her, depended on the king's practical activity. Throughout his life he loved Homer. A copy of the poet's work was kept under his pillow with his sword, and he bestowed on it a gorgeous case from the spoils of Darius's tent after Issus. One day, when a messenger came running to announce a victory, he said, "By the joyful expression of your face, one would say that Homer had risen from the dead." When far away in Asia, he wrote home for books, and received copies of nearly all the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and various books of dithyrambic hymns to Dionysus. Whether due to the imagination of his biographers or no, Alexander seldom speaks except, like Plato's Spartans, in some brief compact saying worthy of remark. The incident of Bucephalus probably occurred when Alexander, at the age of 16, about to be plunged into the affairs of state, was discontinuing Aristotle's tuition, although his master continued to live in Macedonia until after his accession, then retiring to Athens to make the Lyceum and the Peripatetics famous. The Thessalian Philonicus brought the beautiful charger Bucephalus to Pella to offer him to Philip for the fancy price of nearly 3,000 pounds. Thessaly was a famous breeding place for horses, and the king was accompanied by the prince and many of the nobles when he went out into the field to see trial made of the black steed with a white star on his forehead. To the general disappointment, he appeared vicious and unmanageable, and was so far from suffering himself to be mounted that he would not bear to be spoken to, but turned fiercely upon all the grooms. Philip was displeased at their bringing him so wild and ungovernable a horse, and the animal was being led away, when Alexander, who had observed him well, said, "What a horse they are losing for want of skill and spirit to manage him." As Philip took no notice of this forwardness, pretending not to hear, he kept repeating his remark, and finally his father said, "My boy, you find fault with your elders as if you could manage the horse better yourself." "That I certainly could," answered Alexander. "We'll have a try," said Philip, "but if you can't ride him, what forfeit will you pay for your presumption?" "The price of the horse," replied his son. The company laughed. The king and prince settled the forfeiture, and Alexander ran toward Bucephalus. Taking the bridle, he turned the horse to the sun, for he had discovered that the shadow which fell before him as he moved frightened him. While the animal's rage and agitation lasted, he merely talked softly to him, stroking him gently. But when he felt him beginning to grow eager, he slipped his mantle to the ground, vaulted lightly upon his back, and without whip or spur, set him going with a light pull of the reins. At last the anxious spectators saw the prince and Bucephalus flying along like the wind, and they recognized that it was indeed a fine horse, but they were speechless with fear for Alexander's safety. They were amazed when Alexander turned and rode him back, the horse quivering with excitement, but docile as a child. Cheers burst forth, but his father wept for joy, and kissing Alexander said, "Seek another kingdom, my son, more worthy of your abilities. Macedonia is too small for you." Macedonia was too small for either of them or for the Macedonians. In this remarkable and immortal way, Alexander had shown a future ruler of the highest kind. He was all his life to be feared, obeyed, and loved, and bullying was to enter little into the matter. In this year, Alexander was entrusted by his father with the regency of Macedonia, while Philip was vainly attacking Byzantium, and when a revolt of a subject tribe near home broke out, Alexander led an army forth, crushed the rising, and planted the agitated country with colonies, one of which he called, in his presumptive way, Alexandropolis. 2 years later he led the fateful charge at Chaeronea, where he saved, it was said, his father's life, and for long afterward Alexander's oak was pointed out near the battlefield. Philip, who at this time loved Alexander as deeply as he wondered at him, was content to hear his son called king, and himself only general. If the Greeks, however, with their fatal blindness to the trend of events at this time, paid any attention to Alexander's feats, they probably considered him a dashing cavalry officer, and nothing more. It remains to be considered the personal appearance of Alexander at the moment of his accession. He had been brought up to disapprove of athletics, as the excellence of the athlete depended on regularity, while for the soldier's life, such as was awaiting himself, the body must be trained to submit to irregularity. Carefully exercised, however, he became like the typical Greek statue, not extremely tall nor overdeveloped, but perfect in proportion and grace. Once the bloom of boyhood was past, he must have been insignificant looking, for we are told that on 2 occasions visitors ushered into the royal presence were in doubt as to which was the king. Perhaps his carelessness of dress and deep mental absorption caused this. In 1795, the first sculpture that could claim to be a portrait of Alexander was discovered in Italy, and is now in the Louvre. It shows the classical locks, the straight Greek forehead, with no break of direction at the starting of the hair, and with the slightly aquiline nose in the same straight line, where the large clearly cut mouth and chin recall, without the dimple, the massive beauty of Michelangelo's David. After the discovery of this bust, inscribed Alexander, son of Philip, the Alexander type became better known than had been possible from the vague descriptions of the ancients, and other representations of the conqueror were found. His successors, who used his name as their battle cry, engraved his head on their coins, and beautiful portraits of Alexander, wearing the lion's scalp of the Heraclid sovereigns of Macedonia, are to be seen on the gold medallions at Tarsus. A bronze statuette, now at Naples, is supposed to be a copy of a life-size portrait of Alexander by Lysippus after the Battle of the Granicus, a Pompeian mosaic, with all the quaintness of drawing of early mosaics, represents him as a warrior at Issus, and he is perhaps to be seen in that battle in the famous reliefs of the sarcophagus of Sidon. From nearly all these sculptures he appears to approximate it to the best Greek types in appearance. His skin, we are told, like that of the original David, was white, with a pleasing flush on cheeks and breast, but his complexion was not like this in the paintings of Apelles, and it is not likely that the warlike Macedonian kept his extreme fairness of face after he left the nursery, nor would it have been considered a beauty at the time. When the Spartan king Agesilaus wished to sell some Asiatic captives as slaves, their clothes found many purchasers, but as to the prisoners themselves, their skins being soft and white on account of their having lived so much within doors, the spectators only laughed at them, while Agesilaus said scornfully to his troops, "These are the persons you fight with." Alexander's lion's mane of hair was yellow and curly, his eyes liquid, and it is said of different colors, the left blue, the right jet black, and his gaze had an extraordinary power both of attraction and command. When he grew up he clean-shaved. His habit of carrying his head a little bent toward the left shoulder has been imitated by aspiring soldiers ever since, and his fault of walking too rapidly for Greek notions of dignity and grace was carefully copied by his successors. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Alexander in Thrace, Illyria, and Greece, 336 through 335 B.C. When the news of Philip's assassination was brought to Athens, the citizens fell into holiday-making. Solemn sacrifice was made to the gods, and it was determined to present a golden crown to his murderer. Demosthenes, laid aside the mourning which he was wearing for his daughter, newly dead, and appeared in public in a rich dress and with a garland upon his head. And his fellow townsmen, forced to pay Philip honor while he lived, now joined, with questionable taste, in insulting his memory. Demosthenes once more roused Greece, representing that it would be an easy task to throw off the yoke of the incapable child who had mounted the Macedonian throne. Nevertheless, he wrote off to the great king for aid. The child, he was 20 years of age, might have been expected to be too busy at home to interfere for some time in Greece. It was only by swift action that he secured the throne, and he and his mother were forced to offer up a holocaust of his kinsmen, including Cleopatra and her infant, a task from which a Macedonian rarely shrank. Pirates attacked the coasts, and the highland tribes took the opportunity of what they thought would be an interregnum to rise. Alexander assembled a council of his father's oldest servants, and listened attentively to the advice they gave him to leave Greece alone, establish order at home, and make himself master of the neighboring barbarians. They knew already that he was a fine soldier, but they did not yet know how fine, and they could not yet have guessed with what consummate ability he would from the first handle the political situation. But he was able to persuade them in a remarkable speech that he must act while his enemy was unprepared. The impression which a ruler makes, he told them, at the commencement of his reign, remains throughout his life. The death of my father has taken by surprise the rebels as much as myself, and we must seize the opportunity before they rally. Then he turned to account the lessons in oratory which he had learned from Anaximenes, not the least useful of lessons for a king, and addressed the populace. The king's name and person had changed, he said, but they should perceive no change in policy or rule, and he besought the Macedonians to give him the same spirits and the same arms with which they had fought for his father for so many years with so much glory. He offered large rewards for faithful service, the one use which Alexander the Great ever had for money. He appeared in Thessaly before the Greeks had any idea of his approach. He had waxed on his way from a child to a youth, he said, and Demosthenes should find him a man before the walls of Athens. Some Thessalians held the narrow pass of Tempe, where 10 soldiers could dispute the passage of an army, but Alexander turned aside and scaled Mount Ausa, cutting steps on its lofty sides, and went on his way. After this surprising feat, Thessaly submitted and paid tribute, the king exempting the city of Phia, whence his ancestor in pattern, Achilles, had come. From Thessaly he proceeded to Thermopylae, and was elected president of the Amphictyons in his father's place. Thebes and Athens made their peace, and a second congress of Corinth appointed Alexander commander-in-chief to carry out Philip's designs in Asia. Sparta alone held severely aloof, saying that it was her custom to lead, not to follow. In a suburb of Corinth took place the delightful meeting of Alexander and Diogenes. The cynic philosopher was basking in the sun in a grove of cypresses, enjoying the good things which he had preferred to a life of care and riches, when the Macedonian conqueror sought him out. Alexander asked him what form a royal favor might take, and the idle philosopher replied, "Only stand aside a little, so that you won't be between me and the sun." Astonished at this reply, and at the man on whom he in his greatness could confer nothing, the Macedonian said, "If I had not been Alexander, I would have been Diogenes." Returning toward Macedonia, he paid a visit to Delphi to have his fortune told by the priestess of Apollo. There were seasons in which the oracle, originally, perhaps, a vernal deity, was dumb, and as this was one of them, the pythoness refused to approach the god. Alexander, however, seized her and was dragging her toward the temple, when she exclaimed, "My son, you are irresistible." He at once released her, saying that that was good enough oracle for him. Apollo had evidently gone a little out of fashion in Alexander's time, and might be treated in a sacrilegious way. When the spring of 335 B.C. came, and all was quiet at home, he set forth against the revolted Thracians. After a 10 days' march, his army came to Mount Hymus, where the Shipka Pass was occupied by a numerous Thracian army. The barbarians had surrounded themselves by a rampart of wagons, which they were prepared to roll down on the enemy. Alexander, however, directed his troops to commence the ascent, instructing the phalanx to open when the wagons came crashing down, and to let them pass, or if they had not time to do this, to throw themselves quickly to the ground with their shields over them, close together, so that the wagons would roll over the smooth metal surface. These stratagems succeeded. The perfectly trained battalions opened for the most part, and the wagons rolled harmlessly down into the valley. But even where they passed over the human railway, nobody was crushed. The Macedonians then charged the heights, uttering their fierce war cries. From their right wing a shower of arrows fell among the barbarians, while Alexander, at the head of the left wing, gained the top. The almost naked and scantily weaponed foe fled to secret hiding places, leaving 1,500 men dead on the field. Across the Balkans were congregated in arms the valiant tribes of the Tribalians, who had come from their homes in what is now Serbia. As Alexander approached, they fled to an island in the Danube. This great stream, then known as the Ister, had been the limit of the Persian Empire at its widest extent, and Alexander had no idea of going beyond the Persians at this point, but he wished to terrify the barbarians by making a demonstration on the other side of the stream. Byzantium, as an ally, had sent him a few ships across the Black Sea to the Danube, and filling these with archers and heavily armed troops, Alexander sailed up the stream. There was, however, a swift, dangerous current round the island, and its steep shores made landing almost impossible for the small force in the boats, while a large army of the warlike Getae had collected on the northern bank of the river to bar his way if he should attempt to cross. He therefore withdrew and waited for nightfall. We shall hear him saying later on a great occasion, "I steal no victory." But we shall always find him stealing a victory when it is the wisest thing to do. The hides which served his soldiers for tents were stuffed with hay and stitched together to serve as boats. The simple craft of the neighboring population of fishermen and pirates were gathered together, and in the dead of the night the soldiers were conveyed over the river to a spot hidden from view of the enemy by a field of standing corn. When dawn came, the Macedonian army stood glittering in battle array by the side of the slumbering foe. The phalanx bristled with its sarissai, while on the right of it stood Alexander at the head of a matchless band of cavalry. The Getae, startled at the awful apparition, did not even wait to be attacked. They fled for their lives to their homes, and on Alexander's approach took their families to the faraway mountains. He razed their chief city to the ground, and then returned to the stream, where he offered sacrifice to Zeus the Saviour, Heracles, and the river god. Many tribes sent ambassadors to make terms with him. From the upper reaches of the Danube came envoys from the Celts, and Alexander evidently thought the moment favorable for taking down their pride. He inquired what they were most afraid of in the world, but as they heard he was leaving for Asia and felt pretty safe in their distant homes, they did not think it necessary to pay him a compliment, and replied simply that they suffered a great deal of terror from the idea that the sky would one day fall down on their heads. Alexander seems to have found no answer, and he used to say afterwards that the Celts were great braggarts. As the Macedonian army was returning homeward through Thrace, news arrived of the revolt of various Illyrian tribes subdued by Philip. A chieftain named Clitus had seized the city of Pelium, almost impregnable from the mountains and thickets that surrounded it. At the king's approach, the rebels made the primitive sacrifice to the gods of 3 boys, 3 girls, and 3 black rams, and sallied forth. Seized, however, with sudden panic at the sight of the phalanx, they retreated in haste and stood a siege in their city. Another tribe, under Glaucius, arrived to the assistance of Clitus, and Alexander found himself in a very difficult position, caught between 2 warlike forces in a wild mountainous country where the enemy held the heights. He therefore retreated, fighting his way through the enemy in his rear, and the Illyrians believed that the king had gone back to Pella. Alexander, however, recrossed the frontier one evening at dusk, fell on the united forces of the foe, and slew nearly all their number. Clytus succeeded in escaping back to Pelium, but not feeling safe there, reduced it to ashes and went into exile. News now came to Alexander of the rising of Greece. For 5 months Alexander had been absent, and the Greeks had been overjoyed to receive tidings that he had been slain by the Tribalarians. A man who pretended to have been an eyewitness of the event described the battle and showed his own wounds to the Thebans and Athenians, who at once rejected the Macedonian supremacy, while the Thebans slew some of the garrison whom Alexander had placed in their Cadmea, and besieged the rest in that stronghold. Demosthenes and the Thebans sent ambassadors to the other Grecian states, and Peloponnesian troops assembled at the isthmus. The great king sent over 300 talents to Demosthenes for war purposes. All this preparation was revealed to Alexander as he crossed into Macedonia from Illyria. He hastily marched south and appeared in Thessaly 7 days after leaving Pelium. 6 days later he encamped in Boeotia, a few miles from Thebes. Rumors had been circulated regarding the approach of the Macedonian army with Alexander at its head, but the Thebans entirely discredited such stories brought in from the countryside, and it was with horror and despair that they at last perceived Alexander's cavalry and infantry advancing across the Boeotian plain, and finally descried the form of the king on his charger. They refused his repeated summons to surrender, although he stated that he would be content with the death of their 2 leaders, and at last the Macedonian general, Perdiccas, commenced the attack, without waiting, it is said, for orders. When the fight had begun, the Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea descended to the king's aid, and after a bitter struggle the city of Epaminondas, forced at every gate, fell into the hands of the enemy. Men, women, and children, combatants and non-combatants, were slaughtered by the victorious troops. 6,000 had been slain when the order went forth for the massacre to stop. Thebes was so hated by her neighbors in Boeotia for her tyranny that it was said the Macedonians could not prevent this carnage, in which they took no part. But there are signs that Alexander wanted to give Greece a severe lesson, and he may also have thought Thebes the only city through which he had anything to fear from a military point of view. He paid Thebes the honor of wiping her out of existence. On the day following the fall of the city, Alexander summoned a congress of the Greeks to decide upon its fate. The voice of the Boeotians was allowed to rule, and the walls and the entire city of 7-gated Thebes was leveled with the ground, to the sound of flutes, after the Greek fashion, the temples alone being spared. Cassander rebuilt the city 20 years later, but the new Thebes never rose to the greatness like the old. 30,000 of the free inhabitants were sold into slavery. Those exempted, besides the priests, were a few who were known to have advocated submission to Macedonia, and those who had in former times been the hosts of Alexander or his father. Moreover, the great Emathian conqueror bade spare the house of Pindarus. Not only was the actual dwelling of the poet left standing in the general destruction of the city, but Pindar's descendants were pardoned their share in the rising. The conqueror himself was touched with pity for his victims, and never in after days refused a favor to any Theban whom he met on his travels, for exile from his city was the saddest fate which could befall men to whom even the dwellers in the next town were foreigners. Many a Theban, as he left his ruined home, must have had on his lips the words of Euripides, the poet, so dear to this generation. Ah, not that, better the end. The green grave cover me, rather, if a break must come in the days I know, and the skies be changed, and the earth below. For the weariest road that man may wend is forth from the home of his father. Athens was preparing in great panic for a siege, but she was not to receive from Alexander the treatment of Thebes. Alexander has been compared to a lion whose first fell wrath was now sated, but there was generally method behind his moods of cruelty. The one fearful example had been made, and his present task was to reconcile the Greeks to their lot. Something, too, must be allowed for the Macedonian respect for Athens. It is to the honor of Philip and Alexander that they recognized that Athens stood for all that was best in the world. Alexander hoped, almost to the end of his life, that she would be brought to sympathize with his aims. He inflicted a merely nominal punishment on her when she lay at his mercy at this time, and it was only her unchanging disapproval that made him, in the end, very bitter whenever the name of Athens was mentioned. He demanded the surrender of the orators who had addressed the people against him, and Phocion called on them to offer themselves up cheerfully for the good of their city. The orator Demosthenes had the invidious task of persuading the city that such a surrender was beneath its dignity. He told the people that the wolf was trying to get hold of the sheepdogs that guard it, worried, some people thought, the Athenian fold. It was decided, through Demosthenes' eloquence, to defy the king, and Athens can have little expected his forbearance. She had given an asylum to the refugees from Thebes, as she was bound in honor to do, against his express commands, and she had stopped the celebration of her mysteries to pay honor to the Theban dead. Alexander, however, moderated his demands. He would accept, he said, the exile of the orator Charidemus as a sign of submission. His offer was accepted by the unwarlike city with relief, and Charidemus went into exile. His tongue was to get him in still worse trouble at the Persian court. Even Athens had sent to congratulate Alexander on his victory at Thebes immediately after she closed her doors behind the refugees from the city, and now congratulations and spacious excuses poured in on him from all parts of Greece, except Sparta. He was at first amused when little Megara offered him her citizenship, but when he learned that no stranger since Heracles had been admitted to that honor, he graciously accepted it. He then returned to Macedonia, and prepared to set forth on the conquest of Asia in the succeeding spring. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Conquest of Asia Minor, 334 through 333 B.C. Alexander had not been 2 years on the throne when he left Macedonian shores forever. His father's ministers, Parmenio and Antipater, strongly disapproved at first of his haste to attack Persia, but Alexander was able to persuade them that if he did not attack Persia, Persia would attack Macedonia. As it was decided to attack Persia, no one will ever know if the king was right, but it seems highly probable. The great king must have seen by this time that gold had done all that it could do, and that, if he was to remain in possession of Asia Minor, he must take up arms against Macedonia. Moreover, but for Macedonia, Greece was so weak that it might easily at this time have been made into a Persian satrapy. The Macedonian progress through Greece had made this clear. Finally, Macedonia could not support all her stirring children. There was no room for them in Greece, and Asia offered them a plentiful field. Alexander reminded his counselors that the 10,000 Greeks with Xenophon in 401 B.C. had penetrated into the heart of Asia and found Asiatic troops no match for them, and that the Lacedaemonian king Agesilaus had ravaged Lydia, Phrygia, and Paphlagonia. In the end, Parmenio became as eager as the king. He was never of much use as a counselor, but until extreme old age he showed himself a general worthy of Philip's praise. Philip, scornful of the democratic institutions of Athens, once said that the Athenians were extremely favored in having a supply of 10 generals yearly. He had found only one, Parmenio, in many years. Long harangues were made to the soldiery about the effeminate Asiatics, who wore trousers and other unseemly garments, and were so wealthy that the spoils of a few pitched battles would make the Macedonians rich for life, nor were appeals to their appetite for glory forgotten. When news arrived of Alexander's preparations, Darius III, who had succeeded to the Persian throne in the year of Alexander's accession, made what he considered adequate arrangements for destroying the rash invader. Adopting the policy of setting Greek to fight Greek, he hired 50,000 Greek mercenaries, over whom was placed Memnon, a Greek of Rhodes. Memnon sought to seize Cyzicus, and from that base prevent Alexander's passage of the Hellespont, But Parmenio managed to keep the city for Alexander, and had everything ready for the king's crossing. Macedonian resources were infinitesimal in comparison with those of Darius, especially as Alexander did not care to call for soldiers, whom he could not have entirely trusted, from the cities of Greece. His army is supposed to have numbered 30,000 foot soldiers and 5,000 cavalry, mostly Macedonian and Illyrian. His fleet was a negligible quantity, while Persia had all the ships of Cyprus and Phoenicia. Despite Philip's wealth, his expenditure had been so great that Alexander not only found the treasury practically empty, but the state heavily in debt, and when he declared war on Persia, he had raised this debt from 500 to 1,300 talents. The great king slept every night with many times that amount under his head and feet. The Macedonian army started with supplies for 30 days only. Before he left, Alexander, who had no gold to scatter, made such large gifts of land to those whom he wished to bind to his service, that at last Perdiccas said to him, "If you give away so much, what will you have left for yourself?" "Hope," replied Alexander. "But in that," answered Perdiccas, "we too share, since we fight with you," and he refused the estate offered him. Antipater was installed as regent of Macedonia during the king's absence, and after sacrificing to Olympian Zeus and giving a great feast to the gods, Alexander said farewell to Macedonia and led his army along the coast through Macedonia and Thrace to Sestos on the Hellespont. Thence he sent Parmenio, with the larger part of the army, over to Abydos by the route which Leander swam in the legendary days of Greece. The king, before crossing, visited Elaeus, where he offered sacrifice on the tomb of Protestilaus, the first Greek to fall in the Trojan War, and prayed that he might land in the foeman's country under better auspices. Then, entering his ship and taking the helm himself, he turned his back on Europe forever. In the middle of the Hellespont he sacrificed a bull to Poseidon and the Nereids, and flung into the sea as an offering the golden cup from which the libations had been poured. As they came into the harbor of Sigium, the king hurled a javelin onto the shore. To take season, our English forefathers would have said. He was the first to leap from the vessel, and he caused altars to be erected, both here and on the spot where he had left Europe, to Zeus, Heracles, and Pallas. At Troy he behaved like a romantic boy on the grand tour. In honor of the shade of his great ancestor Achilles, he and his companions ran naked to the hero's tomb, on which they poured oil and placed a garland. Hephaestion, says legend, crowned the tomb of Achilles' friend Patroclus, to signify that he loved Alexander as Patroclus loved Achilles. Hephaestion had not yet become Alexander's favorite, but in after days his death was to be mourned by the king in as tragic a fashion as that in which the old Homeric hero bewailed the slaughter of his companion. Someone, perhaps a mendicant, or even a curiosity vendor at his stall, offered the king the lyre of Paris, only to be told sternly, "I care nothing for this vile instrument of unwarlike delights. Bring me Achilles' lyre, that will play the kind of music I shall like to hear." The shade of Pyrrhum received its honors, and special sacrifice was offered to the goddess Pallas, who had been so helpful to the Greeks in the Trojan War. In her temple Alexander left his arms, taking in their place some said to have been consecrated there from the time of the fall of Troy. He secured what he believed was the immortal shield of Achilles, and in days to come it was to save him in a miraculous fashion. Alexander picked up his armor, every piece notable, as he went on. His cuirass was among the spoils of the battle of Issus. The king of Citium gave him his famous sword, and the Rhodians presented him with his belt, made by the renowned Helicon. His helmet, the work of Theophilus, shone like silver, and was adorned by a lofty and magnificent white feather, terrible to see as it nodded in war. These arms, objects of veneration for long after the conqueror's death, came into the possession of the Roman general Pompey the Great, and were shown by him in his last triumph. Alexander joined Parmenio at Arispe, and commenced to take the towns in the neighborhood, unopposed by the Persians. They may have thought to get him away from his ships and then utterly destroy his army, but it was more likely the fatal Asiatic custom of waiting to be attacked. Again and again in Asia the Persians allowed Alexander to choose his battlefield and his time and mode of fighting. The satraps of the west assembled at Zelaya, a city at the foot of Mount Ida, and the able Greek mercenary Memnon advised them to lay waste the country and retire, so that the Macedonians, who had no commissariat, would be driven by famine to retreat. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet could have forced its way into the Hellespont and cut off the Macedonians' return route. If this scheme had been carried out, the world might never have heard again of Alexander the Great. But the satraps did not entirely trust Memnon, and they were afraid that Darius would not approve of their abandoning the peoples of Asia Minor to the mercy of the invader. The more so as, far from appreciating the danger, he expected them to destroy the invading force as it was trying to land. To make Memnon further suspect to the Persians, Alexander, as usual aware of what was passing in his enemies' minds, forbore to ravage some estates of Memnon's. It was at a ford of the river Granicus, a stream which rises in Mount Ida and falls into the Sea of Marmara, the Propontis, near Cyzicus, that Alexander found the satrap's army stationed on the opposite bank, awaiting him. The spirits of the Macedonians failed them when they saw the wide, rapid river running between steep banks and guarded by a force inferior indeed to their own in infantry, but infinitely superior to it in cavalry. To ford the stream within range of the enemy and climb the bank in disorder in its face seemed madness. Parmenio advised the king to wait to see if the Persians would retire, but Alexander answered, "I should be ashamed, Parmenio, if, after having crossed the Hellespont so easily, I should be stopped by this brook. Moreover, the Persians might regain courage by our hesitancy, as being a match in war for Macedonians." He arranged his army in the usual Macedonian way, with the phalanx in the center, the cavalry on the wings. To Parmenio was always entrusted the supreme command on the left, while Alexander himself led on the right. The Persian cavalry numbered about 20,000, and their infantry was somewhat less than that. This great cavalry force was placed in front of the Persian infantry, and was densely massed at the spot where it was thought Alexander would try to land. The enemy saw clearly his shining armor and great white feather, and knew who he was by the respect paid him. At last they perceived him give a word of command, followed by a movement of his host. Amyntas, son of Arrhabaeus, at the head of the skirmishing cavalry, the Paeonians in one infantry regiment, rushed into the river. Then, with a flourish of trumpets and shouting of their war cry to Ares, the right wing under Alexander entered the water, the king keeping his line extended obliquely in the direction of which the stream flowed, to guard against Persian attack on his flank as he emerged from the water. Javelins and darts were showered down from the high bank opposite as the Macedonians sought to land, and after they had forced their way up, a fierce fight took place on the brink of the stream. Alexander became the center of a desperate cavalry engagement, in which it seemed as if the invaders would be thrust backward and downward into the water. It was some time before the Persians began to give way and were pushed back into the plain. Alexander's spear was shivered, and a guard from whom he demanded one brandished a broken stump and bade him ask of some one else. Demaratus of Corinth, one of the companions, gave him his, and Alexander dashed away to smite Mithridates, son-in-law of Darius, to the ground. Rhoesus thereupon struck Alexander with such force that a piece of his helmet fell off, and the scimitar touched his hair, but Alexander, turning, pierced him with his lance. Spithridates, satrap of Lydia and Ionia, stole behind Alexander, and had raised his scimitar to slay him through the hole in his helmet, when Cletus, brother of his foster mother Lanus, prevented the blow by striking off the satrap's arm. By this time the entire Macedonian army stood in order on the Persian side of the stream, and made a charge which broke the Persian center. It turned, and the wings followed. Alexander did not pursue far. The strongest part of the Persian army, the Greek mercenaries, of whom no use had been made, still stood where they had first been posted, on a neighboring eminence, and against these he now turned. After a sharp skirmish in which the young king's horse, he was not riding Bucephalus, was killed under him, 2,000 of them were taken prisoners, the rest slain, with the possible exception of a few who had crept in among the dead upon the battlefield. The captives were sent in chains to Macedonia to till the soil, on the ground that they were fighting against Greece for foreigners in defiance of the Edict of Corinth. About 25 Macedonian companions had been slain at the onset. Alexander ordered bronze statues of them to be made by Lysippus, and in 148 B.C., when the Roman governor Metellus conquered Macedonia, he carried away these statues to decorate the portico of his own house in Rome. The Macedonian losses at the Granicus were very light, and Alexander granted the parents and children of the slain freedom from military service and from various imposts, and visited and chatted with the wounded, letting them show their wounds and brag of their deeds. The conqueror, in the first flush of success, sent to Athens to inform her of a victory in which he took no pleasure, and presented the old leader of Hellas against Persia with 300 suits of Persian armor, to be hung up in the Acropolis with the inscription, "Alexander, son of Philip, and all the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians, present this offering from the spoils taken from the Asiatics." Much of the spoil, precious raiment, and goblets he sent to his mother. It is significant, however, that the public offering went to Athens, not to Pella, showing that he thought little of Pella and much of Athens, and also that he hoped to stir up in Athens her old ardor against Persia. Alexander proceeded to form Asia Minor into a Macedonian province, exacting the same tributes that Darius had received, and allowing old institutions to continue. Some of the Greek cities resisted him, but most of them seized the opportunity to overthrow the oligarchy or tyranny under which they suffered, and establish democracies under Macedonian protection. Persia had rarely allowed democratic constitutions. In a few cities, garrisons, mostly composed of faithful Greek mercenaries, stood out for their Persian employers. Sardis sent ambassadors to proffer submission, thereby saving Alexander the siege of a town with a citadel on an almost impregnable rock surrounded by a threefold wall. The account books he found here showed what large sums the Greeks, especially Demosthenes, had received for anti-Macedonian propaganda, and from this time forward he cared less for the opinion of the Athenians. Perhaps he did not know before what sums had been spent by his father in winning over a pro-Macedonian party in Greece. His father, we are told, warned him that bribery was bad policy, fearing that Alexander should try to make his own party in the state, and the boy may quite well have felt a shock when he learned that the so lofty-seeming Athenians could be bought and sold. After a few years he ceased to write to anybody in Europe as a friend, except Antipater and the Athenian orator Phocion, who had spoken for him against Demosthenes. The Greek mercenaries at Ephesus fled at the news of the Granicus, and the people were just about to stone their oligarchs to death when Alexander arrived. He had a triumphal reception in this great city where St. Paul was afterward to live and work. Apelles, the only painter whom Alexander would ever allow to portray him, lived here, and perhaps the artist now made a quick study of the youthful conqueror, fresh from his first great battle in Asia. To replace the temple of Artemis, destroyed on the night of his birth, Alexander allowed the city to keep the tribute due to him as successor of Darius, and in the new temple was placed one of Apelles' portraits of the king, holding the lightning, a marvelous work of art. Lysimachus reduced most of the cities of Ionia and Aeolia, but Miletus, the chief city of Ionia, until its destruction by the Persians in 494, offered a more serious resistance. Alexander's admiral, Nicanor, secured the harbor, but the Persian fleet lay anchored near, ready to give assistance to the garrison, and Parmenio advised Alexander to fight a naval battle. Alexander, however, knew that the enemy was stronger at sea than himself, and refused. The Milesians offered the Macedonians privileges of trading equal to those they gave the Persians, but received the answer that they must expect an attack at daybreak. On the morrow Nicanor held the harbor while Alexander's battering engines made breaches in the city's walls. Soon the soldiery streamed into the town and slew nearly all the inhabitants. 300 escaped by leaping down into the sea and floating on their shields to a neighboring island, but they were captured and compelled to enter the Macedonian army as mercenaries. The Persian fleet, unable to tempt the astute young soldier into an engagement, sailed away. In the siege, Alexander's 2 foster brothers were slain. In this city, which had been so great and flourishing of old, there stood so many statues of Milesian athletes of distinction that Alexander cried, "Where are all these strong people when the Persians conquered you?" And no doubt he thought of what Aristotle used to say about the uselessness of athleticism. The most desperate resistance with which Alexander met in Asia Minor was at Halicarnassus, the present Bundrum, a Carian city on the southwest coast, strongly placed and strongly fortified. Visible from far in Alexander's time was the gigantic quadriga with the statues of Mausolos and Artemisia, which now stand in their majesty in the British Museum. The city had a garrison of Asiatics and Greek mercenaries under Memnon, whom Darius, too late, had appointed governor of Lower Asia, as well as supreme commander of the fleet, and it had several warships in the harbor. For long Alexander employed in vain the great siege engines evolved in the century in Syracuse and perfected by Philip and himself. No better artillery was made for many a long day. The Macedonians filled up the trench, 30 cubits wide and 15 cubits deep, dug by the citizens round their wall, under a fire of ammunition from the ballistae of the besieged. When at last the wall began to give way before their battering engines, they found that the defenders had built up a second wall, in the shape of a crescent, behind the first. Daring sorties and daring attacks caused much bloodshed on both sides. Not wishing to repeat the carnage of Ephesus, and yet determined not to be merciful in the face of defiance, Alexander spared the city when he might have taken it, hoping to receive a surrender, as it was plain that it would hold out no longer. Memnon, however, meant to fight to the end. He caused the weapons in the town to be set on fire lest they should fall into Macedonian hands, and prepared to retreat to the citadels still untaken. The wind bore the flames toward the houses, and at midnight the Macedonians saw the city they had determined to take on the morrow wrapped in raging flames. The king at once led out his troops, entered the town, and slew the incendiaries. Most of the defenders escaped to the citadels, and Alexander decided to leave them there. Razing their city to the ground, he appointed Ptolemy with a strong force to hold this region. As viceroy of Caria, he instituted Aeta, its former queen, who adopted him as her son. She was sister of the famous Mausolas, husband of Artemisia, the builder of the mausoleum, and had been deposed from her throne by another brother. At Alexander's approach she went to meet him and offered the surrender of the city of Alinda, which she still ruled, and she was treated by him in a way that did much to reconcile neighboring native potentates to his rule. The queen's gratitude took the form of sending Alexander wonderful table delicacies and the offer of chefs, but the pupil of Leonidas told her that his mouth was easy to please, and his old governor had taught him how to find the best cooks. Walk from break of day till dinner time, and for supper appetizer a small dinner. From Caria, Alexander sent home the young men who had married just before leaving Macedonia, and might naturally be supposed to wish to visit their wives. Their officers were to bring them back with as many recruits as possible in the spring. He then dispatched Parmenio by way of Sardis to Phrygia, where all were to meet for the campaign of 333 B.C., and himself spent the winter in subjugating the inhabitants of the Lycian and Pamphylian coasts. His fleet was so poor that he disbanded it as useless. He had probably already conceived the idea of winning over the enemy's fleet by seizing the seaboard. In any case, he could not leave the strongest part of the hostile force behind him, and so, instead of pushing on to the Persian capitals in the following spring, he had determined to make himself master of the entire coast of the Persian Empire from the Hellespont to the western frontier of Egypt. In Lycia, Mamaria, offered a stubborn resistance, and finally her citizens fired their town and escaped to the mountains. At Phaselis, Alexander rested, as the roads were impracticable, and honored the memory of his dead friend Theodestes, a fellow pupil under Aristotle. A Lycian spring, we are informed, cast forth an inscription: "The end of the Persian Empire approaches." In Pamphylia, Alexander sent part of his army by the mountain road, and himself proceeded by the beach at a point only uncovered when the north wind blew, in ordinary times. Now some miracle occurred: either the wind changed suddenly to the north, or the boisterous sea retired. Alexander's luck was proverbial in a later irreverent age. Turning inland, the king then proceeded toward Phrygia, the place he had appointed for a general meeting for the next campaign. At Gordium, the capital of the old Phrygian kings, on the Persian royal road, he found the young married men and new levies from Macedonia, and also ambassadors from Athens, to beg for the release of the Athenians captured fighting for Persia at the Granicus, and now convicts in Macedonia. The request was refused on this and several other occasions, but was ultimately successful. At Gordium, in the temple of Zeus, Alexander was shown a cart on which, it was said, Gordium, father of King Midas, used to drive. It was a very common object, with the exception of intricate knots of which the ends were hidden, fastening the yoke. The inhabitants affirmed that an oracle had declared that he who should untie the knot should be king of Asia. Naturally, Alexander was expected to make an attempt to unloosen the knot, and he offered to do so. A crowd of Phrygians and Macedonians stood round the king, the Phrygians curious, the Macedonians fearful of his failure. He tried in vain to undo it in legitimate fashion, and then boldly cut the knots with his sword, saying, "How doesn't matter." All his plans for becoming lord of Asia were prospering. Memnon, the only Persian leader of talent, had been busily capturing islands in the Aegean at the head of a powerful fleet, but was now dead, while Antipater, regent in Macedonia, had managed to rake together some ships and had captured 8 Phoenician vessels one dark night. After subjugating Cappadocia and receiving the submission of Paphlagonia, Alexander in 333 B.C. advanced to the gates of Cilicia, as the chief pass over the Taurus at this point was named. The gates being guarded, he tried a night attack. His approach was observed, but the discovery served him better than a surprise would have done, so invincible did he already seem. The defenders fled when they saw his form, and at dawn, thanking his lucky stars or the gods, Alexander passed through the gates and descended into Cilicia, devastated by the Persians who, again too late, were following the former advice of Memnon. Now they had fled when, from the mountains above, a small force could have easily stoned Alexander's army to death as it walked 4 abreast through the narrow pass. They were about to destroy Tarsus when Alexander, by a forced march, appeared and saved the city, and then the Persians abandoned a province made easy to defend by nature herself. Tarsus, the birthplace of St. Paul and the last resting place of Julian the Apostate, was an important city from its position on the river Cydnus, at a point where roads led north to the Cilician gates, the entrance to Asia Minor, and east to the Syrian gates, the entrance to Syria. Here, through bathing in the Cydnus, now the Tersos Chai, while very hot, perhaps already feverish, Alexander fell dangerously ill. His recovery was despaired of by all but his childhood's doctor, Philip. Philip was tending him and about to give him a dose of medicine when a messenger hastened in with a letter from Parmenio, stating that Philip had been bribed by Darius to poison the king. Alexander read the letter, handed it to Philip, and, while the latter was reading it, drained the cup. He recovered, and ever afterwards showed great favor to Philip. There was no doubt some laughter against Parmenio, but the moral of the story was Alexander's royal fearlessness. From Tarsus, Parmenio was sent on to capture the Syrian gates, while Alexander visited Anchialus. Here were the ruins of a city said to have been founded by the last Assyrian king, Sardanapalus, and written on a monument in Assyrian characters, Alexander saw this inscription: so alien from his own turn of thought. Sardanapalus built Anchialus and Tarsus in one day. But do thou, O stranger, eat, drink, and be merry, since that is the best life has to give us. The king went on to Soli, now Mestakli, whence our word solecism has sprung. Through the rough Greek spoken by its people, he left a garrison there, and thence dashed inland into the mountains, and defeated a little gathering of desperate Cilicians. Returning to Soli, he received news that the last citadel of Halicarnassus had fallen, and that all resistance was dying out in Caria. He then offered sacrifice to Asclepius for his return to health, and held games in a torch race. Leaving Soli, he performed sacrifices at Malus, to the shade of Amphilacus, and there received news that Darius was encamped within 2 days' march of the Syrian gates. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. The Conquest of Syria and Phoenicia, 333 through 332 BC. In the late autumn of 333 BC, the great battle of Issus took place. Darius, the unfortunate Persian monarch whose reign fell in Alexander's day, had at last taken the field in person against the Macedonian invader, and assembled a vast oriental army on a Syrian plain very suitable for arraying such a force. Darius was burning with impatience to meet his enemy, and as Alexander still tarried in Cilicia, he broke up his camp and sought him, believing that he had retreated on news of the approach of such an overwhelming force, led by the sacred majesty of Persia. Thus he entered Cilicia by the Amani gates, at the same time that Alexander was hastening into Syria by the Syrian gates. The Athenian orator Charidemus, now living at the Persian court, was slain for warning Darius of the excellence of the Macedonian army. And evil dreams in vain visited Darius's pillow as he tossed on the magnificent couch in his rich tent. In Asia and in Greece it was believed that Alexander's army could never face the multitudinous host of Asia, led by the great king in person. When Alexander heard that he had passed Darius unawares, he turned and came up with him at Issus, and was hardly able to believe his own good fortune in the chance of the battlefield. The superiority of the Asiatics in numbers was entirely nullified by the nature of the ground, a coast plain only 3 miles broad. The river Pinaris, which flows west into Issus Bay, lay between the two armies, and Alexander proceeded to arrange his lines on the south side of the stream, with the sea to his left and the mountains to the right, as near to the sea as possible, so that the foe who held the mountain heights might not cast down missiles on his army. At the same time he had to guard against the possibility of being outflanked on his right. As it turned out, the Asiatics on the heights fled when a small force that Alexander sent to keep them in check approached, and troops detached by Darius to turn the flank of the Macedonians failed to execute their orders. Alexander made one of the eloquent speeches with which he roused his soldiers' hearts to war. When he closed, the soldiers shouted with one voice that they only wished to be led on. The king then rode slowly forward, restraining their impetuosity so that they might not be out of breath. But when he came to the Pinaris, he let them go. They dashed swiftly across the stream and up to its precipitous sides to meet the foe on the top of the bank. A cavalry fight like that at the Granicus followed. The riders were so closely locked together that even those who wished to do so could not fly. All the time Alexander, both soldier and general, sought to come to Darius, clear to view, seated in his chariot in the center of his army and surrounded by his chief subjects. His valiant brother, Thrace, a prominent figure, fought near him, slaying every would-be assailant, and round the royal chariot soon lay a heap of corpses of the most distinguished Persians slain in the defense of Darius. Alexander, in endeavoring to reach him, received a wound in the thigh. At length the Persian monarch, who had shown great personal courage in earlier years, was either seized with panic or thought it right to save himself. He turned to flee away in his chariot, but the country soon proving too rough, he leaped to the ground, cast off the insignia of royalty, leaving even his bow, and rode away on a horse kept for this contingency. The two great kings had come face to face, and the genius of Darius was rebuked under that of Alexander. The greater part of his army followed him in flight, these soldiers throwing away their armor that they might fly the faster. Alexander longed to pursue, since Asia was not his until he had captured Darius, but he was forced to return by a call for help from his own left wing. The Persian right had compelled the Thessalian cavalry on Alexander's left to give ground, even pushing them back across the Pinaris. Before he arrived, however, the Thessalonians had rallied and slain their opponents, daunted by the way the battle had gone on the other side of the field. Alexander then set out in pursuit of the fugitives, but the great king was already far away, and at nightfall he returned. Sparta and Athens at this time were rejoicing over tidings that Alexander was blocked up in Cilicia by the Persians in the last extremity. Meanwhile, 100,000 Asiatics. Footnote: we cannot be sure of these numbers, and it seems probable that the accounts exaggerate. Close footnote. Lay dead upon the field or along the line of flight, a ravine being bridged by the pursuers by filling it with corpses, and the air around them was heavy with the scent of death and resounding with the howls of beasts of prey. The Macedonian conquerors were holding their revels in the tents of the vanquished at Alexander's return, and he found that his soldiers had already entered the tents of the enemy, religiously reserving for their king the personal possessions of Darius, including his wife and children. The greater part of the baggage, with most of the women and children, had been bestowed at Damascus, but there were nevertheless much to seize in the luxurious Persian tents. The king found the ground strewn with purple raiment, gold, silver, and precious stones dropped by the pillagers on their way to their own quarters, while the shrieks and sobs from the women's quarters testified to the brutality with which the non-combatants were being treated by the rough soldiery. Alexander arrived hot and dusty from the chase of the Persians, and exclaimed eagerly as he entered the camp that he should wash off the sweat of battle in Darius's own bath. He amused himself with all the toilet accessories of the great king, the basins, ewers, and vials of perfume, all of purest gold, wrought with skill, and with luxuries and appointments new to his simplicity. He examined the bedchamber and feast prepared, and then, instead of flouting it as a Spartan king would have done, he said, "This was a king indeed." A new notion of monarchy was already forming in the mind of the Macedonian chief. He and his intimates, bathed and properly perfumed, were enjoying their magnificent feast, when they became aware of anguished groans in the neighboring tent. Alexander sent the guard, who entered and found the ancient Sisygambis, mother of Darius, and his beautiful wife, Statira, with her children, lamenting the death of Darius. The royal mantle had been found and brought to the harem as a sure token of the great king's death. Alexander, it is said, was moved to tears, and sent Leonatus and some guards to assure the royal family that Darius lived. They received the news of Leonatus's approach in sullen silence, believing that Alexander had sent to murder them in their turn. The messenger was forced to enter unbid, and they threw themselves at his feet to beg, not for life, but that before death they might bury Darius with due rites. Their fears were at once dispelled, and they were treated by Alexander in a way that was highly praised by the ancients. It is even said that his captives became attached to him as to a son and protector, and afterwards, shortly before his death, he married one of the children, Statira. Alexander continued southward along the coast of Phoenicia, sending Parmenio to Damascus to secure the treasure of Darius. At Marathus a letter from Darius arrived, begging for the surrender of his mother and wife and children, and reproaching Alexander for his invasion of Asia. To this letter Alexander replied that the predecessors of Darius had invaded Greece, that Darius had commenced the present war by aiding Alexander's Grecian enemies, and that Darius had bribed his father's assassins. He was a murderer and usurper, But if he came to Alexander in person, and Alexander would send hostages, he should receive whatever he should demand, but in future, concluded the king, address me as King of Asia, and not as your equal. Make your request as of one who is lord of all your lands. If you do not do this, you will be considered as a rebel, or, if you like, we will fight another battle on the subject, and save yourself the trouble of running away, for wherever you go I shall follow you." Alexander then left Marathus and occupied Byblos, which stood on a hill near the sea. It was said to be the oldest city in the world, and the birthplace of Adonis. Sidon welcomed him eagerly. He deposed its king, a Persian protege, and a romantic story is told of the choice of a new king by Hephaestion. According to the laws of Sidon, the sovereign must be of the royal house, and it appeared that a humble gardener in the district was of this blood, besides being of primitive virtue. The deputies of Hephaestion sought him out and found him weeding. They saluted him as king, bathed him, clothed him in purple, decked him with the royal insignia, and led him to the palace, where he managed to keep his simple nature unspoiled. Tyre alone and Phoenicia remained independent. Old Tyre lay on the mainland, Tyre proper on an adjacent island, the island of the Princess of the Sea, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty, described by the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel. Shalmaneser had besieged it for 5 years, and Nebuchadnezzar had invested it for 13 years in vain, although the king of Tyre ultimately consented to pay tribute, and the city was now tributary to Persia. Alexander sent to inform its king that an oracle had bidden him sacrifice to Heracles, with whom Melkart, an old Phoenician deity, was identified, and the famous temple in their city. The Tyrians replied that they were willing to obey any other command of his, but would suffer neither Persian nor Macedonian to enter the city. The king wished to sacrifice. There was a more ancient temple of Heracles at Old Tyre. Alexander then knew that he must attack the island, even if it proved difficult as the labors of Heracles. Its capture would mean the possession of the celebrated Phoenician navy for war purposes, the absolute sovereignty of the sea, Macedonia and Greece safe behind him, and the easy conquest of Egypt. The siege of Tyre is the most interesting in the history of classical warfare, and illustrates the courage, inventiveness, patience, and good fortune which are so equally mixed in Alexander's life. He could not match the fleet of Tyre, rich in ships, and in order to conquer the city by land, set about to destroy its island condition, starting the construction of a mole 200 feet broad from the mainland to the island. The strait, about half a mile wide, was shallow near the mainland, but about 3 fathoms deep near the island, and the current at that point, where Alexander commenced the mole, bade him defiance. Abundant timber for the work was found on the mountains of Lebanon. Stone was obtained from Old Tyre, and these, heaped high as a mountain on the shore, were thrown down into the sea in alternate layers, stakes fixed in the mud of the channel holding the pier together. As long as the masons worked at a distance from the island, all went fairly well, but when they came into deeper water, and at the same time approached the city, they suffered severely under missiles from the walls. Then, too, the Tyrian triremes kept sailing up and attacking the workmen, clothed for work, not for war. 2 wooden towers were erected on the mole, and protected from the fire-bearing missiles of the enemy by specially prepared hides, which were also placed where they might screen the workers. From these towers missiles were hurled at the Tyrian ships. In reply, the Tyrians filled a vessel with dry fuel, chaff and torches, pitch and brimstone. They fixed 2 masts on the prow, and stretched on each a double-yard arm, from which they hung cauldrons of combustibles. Triremes towed the heavily laden vessel toward the mole and towers, and sailors threw fire from the vessel among the wood, at the same time running her aground as violently as possible, and dashing her against the end of the mole. If skill and heroism could have saved Tyre, she would not have been wiped off the face of the earth. As her crew swam away, a great flame caught Alexander's towers, and burned those within them to death. The triremes hovered near and discharged showers of missiles on those who leaped down into the sea or those who approached to extinguish the flames, while fresh detachments from the city sailed out and did as much damage as they could to the mole and to the engines of war. A storm aided the Tyrians in their work of destruction. Alexander had then to start his work afresh, and did so with dogged perseverance. The new mole was to have a wider base, contain more towers, and be in a direction better adjusted to the storms on this coast. How many years might have been consumed by the Macedonians in this way we cannot say, but a piece of great fortune now befell them. The sister city of Tyre, not content with giving her no aid, as they had submitted for the most part to Alexander, now sent him their ships, while the kings of Cyprus, an abode of the Hittites, whose history is so much interesting, though learned world today, sent him 120 vessels to Sidon. With these he could blockade Tyre. At the head of a magnificent fleet he sailed from Sidon, ready for his first naval battle. The Tyrians had been anxious to fight Alexander at sea, but drew back when they found to their dismay that he had obtained all the ships of Cyprus and Phoenicia. The city had two harbors, one the Sidonian on the north, looking towards Sidon, and the other Egyptian on the south, and those were now filled with Tyrian triremes in battle array. Alexander placed the Cyprian ships outside the Sidonian harbor, the Phoenician outside the Egyptian harbor, and himself took up his position near his mole. His artillery was turned on from the towers, and the Tyrians answered from towers constructed on their battlements to face the mole. The city walls were about 150 feet high and of great breadth, and it was not easy for ships or horses to convey battering engines near enough to make a breach, as large stones were cast down by the besieged. Alexander stationed ships to seize these stones and convey them by means of cranes into deep water, but Tyrian divers cut the cables and made anchoring impossible. Red-hot brass shields full of burning sand and boiling filth were thrown on their heads, but at last the besiegers got close enough to batter down the wall, and the besieged, in the last straits, determined to make a surprise sortie from the Sidonian harbor. In their despair they even thought of making human sacrifice to the gods. At about midday, when the Macedonian sailors were scattered in quest of necessaries, and Alexander usually retired to his tent, a few Tyrian vessels, with picked rowers and fighters, sailed out quietly in single file and attacked the Cyprian fleet. It happened, however, that Alexander on that particular day did not stay in his tent. He saw the Tyrian ships sail out, and hastily manned a few vessels, with which, before the rest were ready, he sailed right round the island to the rescue. The Tyrians sought to fly back into harbor, but the king forced them to an engagement, and disabled most of their vessels. He then sailed round the city walls, testing every part, for he had not been able to shake the wall opposite the mole, and found a weak portion of the south side. A breach was made, and Alexander tried to throw a bridge over, but was beaten back. On the third day following, he made attacks on all sides to distract the enemy. Breaches were opened, bridges thrown on to the broken wall, and Alexander among the foremost to mount. The wall was scaled. Admetus, the first to ascend, was struck dead with a spear as he stood cheering, and the citizens disputed every inch of the way with the enemy. Advancing along the battlements, Alexander descended to the royal palace. Meanwhile, the Phoenician and Cyprian fleets had forced their respective ways into the two harbors, and captured the Tyrian fleet. The Tyrians for some time hurled stones from the roofs of their houses down on the Macedonians, and made a last stand at the fane of Agenor, father of Cadmus, the legendary founder of Tyre and Sidon, as of Grecian Thebes. 8,000 were slain, the rest, about 30,000, sold into slavery. Massacre commonly followed conquest in the East then as it does today, but Alexander was in so bloodthirsty a mood that his own soldiers were revolted. Thus fell Tyre after a 7-month siege, the end of July or beginning of August, 332 B.C. The coast regions of Palestine submitted, with the exception of Gaza, which the eunuch Battus had fortified and considered stronger than Tyre. It was the last city met with by the traveler going from Phoenicia to Egypt, at the parting of the desert and the Saône, and stood upon a lofty mound surrounded by a strong wall. Alexander, expert now in sieges, attacked the foundations of this town, built upon the sand, and caused a countermound to be constructed. On this the artillery used at Tyre was placed, and after a 2 months' siege, this city also fell. The inhabitants stood fighting for long after the Macedonian army had entered, as they knew from the fate of the Tyrians what alternative to death there was for them to choose, and nearly 10,000 were slain. Their women and children were then sold into slavery by the conqueror. These terrible examples made other cities chary of bidding Alexander defiance, and were therefore necessary to his conquests. But as Alexander's gigantic plans unfold, he seems to get farther and farther away from normal human nature. At Gaza he appears to have shown barbarous cruelty, perhaps partly on account of the 2 wounds he had received during the siege. Tyre rose again to greatness in Roman times, but Gaza, which Alexander used as a frontier fortress, was then still desolate. If, however, Alexander was to conquer the Persian Empire, and we do not know at this day the weight of his reasons for doing so, these deeds of cruelty were mercy, for numbers of cities that would have fought for Persia now peacefully submitted. Even his treatment of Battus, if true, may have been calculated. It depended on the satrap of Egypt as to whether that province should be organized to resist Alexander, or be delivered over to him without a blow being struck. When Mazdax heard of the barbarous treatment suffered by the commander at Gaza, he probably laid aside any ideas he had entertained of resistance. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. Alexander in Egypt, 332 through 331 B.C. Darius had sent again to Alexander, offering to divide his empire with him, and suggesting the Euphrates as the boundary. Alexander must return his royal captives, and should receive 10,000 talents, over £2,000,000, and the hand of the daughter of Darius. Parmenio ventured to say, "I should close with those terms if I were Alexander." He received the scornful answer, "And so should I if I were Parmenio." None of the followers had the slightest suspicion that Alexander was burning to push on to the world's end, over Media, Hyrcania, Bactria, Sogdiana, the Hindu Kush, and India to the ocean. He sent answer to Darius that he could not offer what no longer belonged to him, and prepared to leave Syria. Before he went, he organized Syria and Phoenicia as he had done Asia Minor, leaving Parmenio to administer Syria until his return. Greece was plunged in despair at the news of the battle of Issus, and various Lacedaemonians, Thebans, and Athenians who had joined the Persians and were captured at Damascus were in great fear, but were treated with great mildness, the Thebans being at once liberated. The conqueror was glad of this chance of clemency toward men who, through his action, were without a city. From the immense treasure taken at Damascus, the Macedonians tested their first of the sweets of Asiatic luxury, and they were already dreaming of the delights of sacking Susa and Babylon. For those who survived, the prize seemed indeed worth it. They little dreamed that in the few short years they were to spend in obtaining wealth, the strength of manhood would become exhausted in their veins, that most of their veterans would have fallen by the way, and their young men become old men through their superhuman exertions, and it was a paltry pittance that in the end those who survived were to take back to Macedonia. From 525 B.C. until this day the immemorial civilization of Egypt has been under the control of foreign powers, Persian, Greek, Roman, Arab, Turk, and Britain, and from its position and fertility it has always proved a valuable possession to its owner, although from 525 B.C. until this day religious questions have always created difficulties between governor and governed. Difficult as it is now for Britain to administer a country largely Mohammedan, it was just as difficult for Persia to keep order 2.5 millenniums ago among a populace who worshipped Isis and Osiris. It was Persia's best milch cow, but she had been foolish enough to treat the native deities with scorn. Hence, beneath outward calm, Egypt was seething with insurrection, and Alexander appeared almost as a liberator. The satrap had heard the news of Issus, the headlong flight of Darius, and the submission or sack of the cities of Syria and Phoenicia, and no doubt, fearing lest he should meet with a fate similar to that of Battus at Gaza, he surrendered Egypt to the king as soon as he appeared upon the frontier. Alexander had ridden by land with his army, while the fleet sailed to Pelusium. He garrisoned Pelusium and sent the fleet up the Nile to the capital, Memphis, then a fair and flourishing city, the rival of Babylon and Susa, 14 miles south of the site of the present Cairo. After a journey across the desert to take Heliopolis, the sacred city of the sun, Alexander too went to Memphis, where he pleased the natives by sacrificing to Ptah and Apis. The Greek gods were gratified by games and a musical festival, to which famous athletes and artists came from Greece at the king's summon. He did not stay long among the glories of Memphis, but set about one of those enormous practical projects which prove him as much ruler as conqueror. Among the Persian treasures taken after Issus was an extremely rich casket, in which Alexander had decided that nothing less precious than his copy of Homer's Iliad might be kept. Homer, pleased with this little attention, proved, as Plutarch says, neither an idle nor an unprofitable companion to him. An old gray-headed man appeared one night in a vision, and recited to him this verse from the Odyssey: "An island lies where loud the billows roar, Pharos they call it on the Egyptian shore." Alexander had decided to settle a Greek colony in Egypt, and had for some time been pondering where it should be. This dream, he said, resolved its doubts. Pharos, where the Ptolemies afterward built the famous lighthouse which became one of the 7 wonders of the world in the place of the great wall of Babylon, destroyed long before, was to be the site of the new city of Alexandria. Alexander had foreseen that a new port on the Mediterranean might grow up to take the place from which Tyre had fallen, and therefore he placed the Greek city, which he built to hold down Egypt, upon the coast. He chose Pharos, then an island, now an isthmus, as the most easterly point at which it was practicable to build a seaport, it being just out of the reach of the heavy deposits from the mouths of the Nile. As Pharos was seen to be too small, he founded his city, in 331 B.C., on the mainland opposite, where the town of Alexandria stands today, between Lake Mariotis and the sea. The king led the way, and one following him scattered barley as he went, to mark the boundaries. A flock of birds carried away these grains, and Aristotle, who attended Alexander wherever he went as soothsayer, foretold from the omens that strangers would flock to the new city, and that it would nourish many countries. Alexander himself marked out the site of the marketplace and temples, and appointed the gods to whom the temples were to be dedicated. Until the foundation of Cairo in the 10th century, and to a large extent until the discovery of the route to India by the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, Alexandria was the greatest trading city in the world. Until Egypt became a Roman province in the 1st century B.C., it had also enormous political importance. It was the capital of the Ptolemies until Cleopatra came to her end, and was known for subtlety, refinement, gaiety, and vice more strangely mixed than in Rome in the days of Nero or France under the last Valois. The residence there of the Ptolemies also made Alexandria the capital of Greek culture, and so it remained until the conquest of Egypt by Mohammedans in the 7th century A.D. The Egyptian climate was peculiarly suited to the preservation of antiquities, and it would be difficult to estimate the world's debt to Egypt for the preservation of manuscript copies of the Greek classics, even as the earliest Greek paintings saved to us are those of mummy faces in Egyptian tombs. We should know much less of the Greeks had Alexander not conquered Egypt. After the rule of the Ptolemies had long passed away, Alexandria was the stage for many important events in the early development of Christianity. Here they sought to break St. Catherine on the wheel. Here Arianism raged, and here the learned Hypatia suffered death at the hands of the Christian mob. Alexandria was to be associated with ends which Alexander could not have foreseen, but its founding was a great conception, and its success points to the sagacity of the founder. His city rising, Alexander left Cleomenes in charge, but one important act remained to be done in Egypt. The ancient pharaohs had been sons of Ammon, and Alexander wished to conciliate the natives of what would be his second richest province by becoming a son of Ammon in his turn. This act of affiliation was never understood, and created almost as great a scandal as if an English administrator of Egypt today should turn Mohammedan. The motive which modern minds ascribe to the king was never guessed at by the men of his time. There was a deep mental chasm between this commander and his soldiery, and even between him and his generals, and they believed in their ignorance that he wished to set himself above ordinary humanity. In the only serious revolt which Alexander ever had to face, the army bade him go and conquer with his father Ammon. Alexander never explained the motives of his actions. He was always right, and he insisted on unquestioning obedience, and therefore he left the Macedonians in their ignorance, an ignorance at which he could hardly complain, for it served him better than if his followers had known his aims. Even a pretense to deity brought with it some political advantage. But once when he was wounded, he said to some of his intimate friends, "This, my friends, is real flowing blood, not ichor, such as immortal gods are wont to shed." The oracle of Ammon in the oasis of Siwa was one of the most famous in the ancient world. Perseus and Heracles had both visited it in their adventurous careers, and Alexander imitated them. He advanced from Alexandria along the desert tract by the coast for about 180 miles to Peritonium, where he received the submission of Cyrene. Then he turned inland. The way lay south over burning, shifting sands, with never a tree or a hill for a landmark, and where neither rain fell nor dew. When Cambyses led his army that way, it was said, the whole desert rose like a sea, and 50,000 were swallowed up in the sands. On the third day water fell short, but miracles, even the best authorities say, befell the Macedonians. Rain fell. Ravens or snakes, there are different accounts, appeared and led the way, and the party arrived at the oasis of Ammon. In this delightful spot of palm and fountain, the king sought the oracle, and obtained from him the confirmation of his sacred status as an Egyptian sovereign. He told his followers that the oracle had told him many important things that he could not divulge, and gave them permission to question it in their turn. The state of their minds may be guessed from the fact that one and all asked the priest if Alexander were really of divine origin, and were one and all informed that they were to treat him as son of Ammon. Some words which Alexander is reported to have let fall are the best commentary on this episode. God, he said, was the common father of us all, but more particularly of the best of us. It was from this time that some of the Macedonians dated Alexander's unbearable lordliness. Ready as they were to honor the representative of the tribe in all due and accustomed ways, they were fiercely opposed to any assumption on his part of Oriental monarchical manners. The Greek was unhappy in the service of a despot, and their young king was becoming a despot. Some, however, think that this change only came after Susa and Persepolis fell into his hands, and the great king had died a miserable death in abject flight before him. The Macedonian nobles, whom Alexander was raising up to be rulers of mighty provinces as he went on, were many of them to feel with the nurse in Medea. Rude are the wills of princes, yea, prevailing always, seldom crossed. On fitful wings their moods are tossed. 'Tis best men tread the equal way. I, not with glory, but with peace, may the long summers find me crown. For gentleness, her very sound is magic, and her usages all wholesome. But the fiercely great hath little music on his road, and falleth when the hand of God shall move most deep and desolate. The son of Ammon returned from the oasis to Memphis, where he assumed the pageant of Pharaoh. Ambassadors of the Greek states, who had sent a golden crown to the conqueror after Issus, had come to seek favors, and recruits sent by Antipater arrived. In Egypt, Alexander established a government of divided command, not being willing to entrust this rich province to a single person. The Romans followed Alexander's policy in this, never sending any man of proconsular rank to administer Egypt, their granary. In the spring of 331 B.C., the king left Egypt and marched back into Phoenicia. At Tyre his fleet met him, and great celebrations and games were again held. Here at last he granted the Athenians' request for the release of their fellow citizens. Several honors were bestowed, and Ptolemy, who was afterward to rule over Egypt, became at this time one of the chief bodyguards. Then the king struck into the interior for his final struggle with Persia. End of chapter 7.